Hey there. Tonight, we are opening a broken piece of clay that may have preserved one of the oldest military secrets in human memory. In a museum vault, under steady light and careful air, a damaged tablet still whispers about flood release, divine commands, and weapons that seem to move with a will of their own. If this kind of dark ancient mystery is your kind of quiet, please like the video and subscribe. Now let the room soften. Let your breathing find its own easy rhythm. We are not going to force the clay to speak too quickly. We are only going to sit beside it and listen. The story begins in a place that does not feel dramatic at all. No thunder, no torchlight, no buried golden chamber. Only the cool hush of a museum archive where history lies in drawers, trays, soft padding, and small white labels. I have always found archives stranger than ruins. A ruin is out in the weather, still arguing with time. An archive is calmer than that. It has already survived the weather. It waits in silence, and somehow that feels more intimate. There, among many old fragments from Mesopotamia, rests a damaged flood tablet known in modern catalog language as CBS 10673. It is not large. That matters. We expect important truths to arrive in grand shapes, heavy doors, towering monuments, something worthy of our fear. Instead, this one comes to us in a brittle rectangle of clay, chipped at the edges, lines broken away, signs missing, whole sections lost to accident and centuries. And yet the surviving words still have enough force to disturb the room around them. Because what remains on that clay does not sound exactly like the sort of myth most people imagine when they hear the words ancient gods. It does not move only in poetry. It does not float only in symbolism. At moments, it becomes procedural, calm, specific. The source begins there because the source wants us to feel that shift immediately. A flood text should already be solemn, but this one carries a different chill. The language suggests authorization, release, sequence, decision. It sounds, in places, less like a priest singing the chaos of heaven and more like a scribe preserving the memory of an operation. That is where the central unease of tonight begins. What if some Sumerian texts were not only preserving religious imagination? What if they were also preserving inherited descriptions of weapons, control systems, and catastrophic tools that later copyists no longer fully understood, but still copied faithfully because the wording felt too important to lose? That possibility changes the whole atmosphere. The source is careful not to throw scholarship out the window. It knows the mainstream view, and the mainstream view has real strength. Ancient literature is symbolic. Divine warfare is often cosmic. Storms become battles. Drought becomes punishment. Kingship becomes mythologized through heavenly conflict. All of that is true, and any serious reading has to admit it. But the source keeps pressing on the details that refuse to stay comfortably symbolic. Named weapons, repeated functions, tactical distinctions, sequences of deployment, temple inventories, storage practices. Fear of mishandling. It is that cluster that makes the old clay feel heavier than ordinary myth. To understand why, we have to step out of the vault for a while and go back to the first cities. Sumer rose between the rivers in the flat southern lands of Mesopotamia, where mud, water, reeds, and human patience gave birth to something the world had never seen before. Cities. True cities. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash. Writing, accounting, mathematics, priestly administration, organized labor, temple economy. The first great attempt to hold the world still with lists and measures. I have always loved that about Sumer. Civilization does not begin with a speech. It begins with inventory. And yet, once people begin writing down grain, labor, and beer allotments, they also begin writing down other things. Kings, floods, divine councils, wars among gods, strange beings who rule, judge, authorize, punish, and command. The source wants us to notice that the Anunnaki in these texts often behave less like eerie personifications and more like a governing order. They hold rank. They issue decisions. They possess cities. They deploy force. They maintain cosmic and political structure in ways that sound unnervingly administrative. You know that feeling when a story about gods begins sounding suspiciously like statecraft. That is exactly the feeling here. In Sumerian and later Akkadian tradition, the divine world is full of offices, jurisdictions, responsibilities, rivalries, and command language. Enlil governs by authority. Anu grants or withholds dangerous power. Ninurta acts as warrior and enforcer. Marduk rises through assembly and receives weapons in sequence. Even the flood, in several traditions, is not merely an emotional outburst. It is debated, approved, and released. That word, released, matters, because it suggests control before destruction. The source lingers on language, and I think that is wise. Sumerian is a linguistic isolate, an old language with no securely known close relative. Later, scribes preserved it long after it ceased to be a daily spoken tongue, much the way later scholars preserve sacred languages whose prestige outlives ordinary speech. That means many of these texts were copied by people already handling old words carefully, perhaps reverently, perhaps cautiously. They did not write them because they were modern journalists. They wrote them because these texts belonged to a chain of preservation. Whatever they meant, someone believed they must survive. That is one of the most haunting things about ancient literature. The people who preserved it did not always fully explain why. For centuries, the wedge-shaped signs slept unread. Tablets were dug up, stored, misread, wondered over. Then, gradually, in the 19th century, the script opened. Akkadian first, then Sumerian more slowly, more painfully. And when the voices returned, they brought back not only hymns and taxes, but records of strange wars, technical inventories of divine powers, and weapons whose behavior does not fit comfortably inside the ordinary Bronze Age imagination. The source first settles on the texts of Ninurta, and that is the right choice. If there is a doorway into the old military strangeness of Mesopotamia, it is him. Ninurta is not simply a heroic blur of battle glory. He is specific. He owns named weapons. Those weapons perform different jobs. They are not always passive tools. Some observe. Some scout. Some devastate at range. Some radiate fear or paralysis. Some are described with an operational texture so steady that the mind begins to shift uneasily in its chair. But before the first named weapon appears, the source wants us to feel one more thing. The scribes themselves. Imagine one of them at night. A lamp burning low in a temple room. Reed, stylus in hand. Fresh clay damp and smooth. Outside, the city breathing in the dark. Dogs now and then. Distant voices. Sandals on packed earth. The river moving somewhere beyond the walls. Inside, only the scratchless pressure of signs being made. He is copying an older text. Older, perhaps, than his master. Older than his grandfather. A text that has survived flood, kings, conquest, and rebuilding. He may not understand every phrase fully. That happens in every intellectual tradition. But he understands the seriousness. The names must remain correct. The sequence must remain correct. The dangerous things must remain named exactly as received. Honestly, I think that image is one of the most human in the whole story. The old knowledge survives because someone keeps copying what he does not dare improvise. This is why the source keeps returning to tone. The tone is not wild. It is not the tone of a man inventing fairy tales by firelight for entertainment. It is the tone of preservation. A weapon is named, and its use is described. A force is listed, and its effect is noted. A command is given, and a result follows. The structure feels calm, and that calm is what makes it eerie. The first opening movement of the story, then, is not about proving anything all at once. It is about arranging the room properly. Broken clay in a museum vault. The first cities of Sumer. Divine rulers who sound oddly bureaucratic. Flood language that feels procedural. Scribes preserving dangerous terms without softening them too much. Once all that is in place, the next step comes naturally, and it comes with a quiet jolt. A weapon of Ninurta that flies. A weapon that sees. A weapon that returns with information. A weapon that sounds, frankly, much less like a ceremonial mace than like something no one in a simple mythic world should have thought to describe at all. That is where the deeper chill begins, and that is where we are going next. The moment the first weapon begins to move on its own, the story becomes difficult to tuck safely away inside the word mythology. That word can still do some work. Of course, it should. Ancient people personified things. Divine objects often speak in old literature. A sword can boast. A storm can think. A city can mourn. Anyone reading Mesopotamian texts has to keep that in mind, or the whole conversation becomes childish very quickly. But the source is not interested in childish certainty. It is interested in repeated behavior. And the repeated behavior of one weapon in particular becomes very hard to ignore. Its name is usually rendered as Sharu. The source brings us into the long composition often called Lugal-e, a text preserved through many tablets and many copies, enough copies to show that the tradition mattered. That detail is important. We are not dealing with one eccentric fragment and building a palace of speculation on it. We are dealing with a literary and scribal tradition repeated over time, stabilized enough to leave a consistent impression. In that tradition, Ninurta possesses a weapon that does something startling. It flies. I do not mean it is merely compared to a bird once for poetic color. I mean the source follows the descriptions and shows that the Sharu repeatedly acts like an aerial servant. It is sent out. It crosses distance. It reaches places ahead of its master. It observes. It reports. In some passages it even advises. Then it returns. If you say that too quickly, it sounds almost silly. That is the danger with strange, ancient material. It can become absurd if rushed. So let us slow it down. Imagine a scribe pressing signs into clay in a room lit only by oil light. He is not a science fiction author. He is not trying to impress a future audience with spectacle. He is preserving inherited descriptions using the language available to him. The weapon of Ninurta leaves its master, travels, sees the enemy or the terrain, and comes back with information. There is no neat Bronze Age category for that. So what does he do? He uses familiar language. The weapon flies like something alive. The weapon speaks because information must somehow be verbalized. The weapon knows because the path it takes seems self-directed. That is not proof of modern technology in the crude sense, but it is a very specific, descriptive challenge, and the source treats that challenge seriously. One line that lingers in the source is the idea that the Sharu knows the mountain, or knows the enemy ground before striking. Another is that other divine beings cannot simply turn it back once it is on its course. Hey there, this matters tonight because it gives the weapon opening a broken piece of clay that may have preserved one of the oldest military secrets in but enough that memory. Ordinary categories begin to blur. Vault. Under steady light and careful air. Yes. A damaged tablet still whispers about flood release. Yes. Divine but commands, not merely thrown. And weapons more like a scout or hunter given a task and the means to complete it. If this kind of dark ancient when a story stops sounding symbolic and starts sounding procedural, like the video by accident, and subscribe. That is the feeling the Sharu creates. The room soften. The source then does something even more find its own easy rhythm. It refuses to isolate the Sharu as one to speak too quickly. Instead, it places it inside a larger arsenal. And listen, that changes the story everything. Begins in a place because one strange weapon can be dismissed as poetic ornament. No thunder. A coordinated inventory of strange weapons is another matter entirely. Golden chamber. Ninurta, only the cool hush of a museum archive, does not carry history lies in possible object. Trays. He carries many named powers and small white labels, each with its own role. I have always the source found archives because the distribution of ruins is what begins sounding tactical. A ruin is out in the weather. One weapon scouts still arguing with another devastates. An archive is another than that. Breaches. It has already survived the weather. Radiates terror. It waits. Another strikes from distance, and somehow this is not just divine glory in a fog. There. Among many old fragments from Mesopotamia, I have always found doctrine, a damaged flood tablet, known in modern catalog language can be dramatic as C, B, Doctrine 10,673. Take the Mitu. It is not the ordinary translation again tries to calm the room. We expect important truths to arrive in grand shapes. Heavy doors, towering monuments. Something worthy of our descriptions rather than the translation. This one comes to us in a brittle rectangle of clay. Mountains at the edges. Lines broken away. Hard surfaces are altered in ways that sound more severe accident than impact centuries. In some interpretations, words still have enough force to disturb imagery suggestive of extreme heat, because what remains on that clay does not sound exactly like the sort of myth most people imagine when they hear the words ancient gods. Now, it does not move. Any honest person has to say, this is debated. It does not float only. Ancient language exaggerates. At moments, it becomes procedural, magnified. Calm, divine destruction is often cosmic. The source begins there. We cannot because the source wants us to feel that shift immediately. But the source is persuasive on one point. Text should already be solemn. The behavior assigned to the Mitu is carries a different chill, too specific. The language suggests authorization to sit comfortably inside the image of a hand-swung sequence. Then comes the shukur. Its sound and the atmosphere grows stranger, less like a priest strikes from the chaos of heaven, and more it is seen like a scribe preserving the memory of that sensory order matters. That is where the central unease of tonight then delay begins, then impact. What if some Sumerian texts were not only preserving religious imagination, describe divine glory? What if they were also preserving inherited descriptions of weapons? Yet when a text calmly preserves the order of perception and catastrophic tools begins that later copyists no longer fully understood. The source wisely does not force a one-to-one equivalence with any modern weapon. It simply asks the listener to notice that the descriptions behave more like observed phenomena. The source is careful, decorative, not to throw scholarship out the window. A distant strike, it knows the mainstream view, flash, and the mainstream view has real strength. The old text does not have our vocabulary for symbolic, shockwave, divine warfare, or long-range delivery. Cosmic. Storms it only has witness language. Honestly, drought becomes punishment. Witness language is often the scariest becomes mythologized through heaven, and then the arsenal deepens with the jittu. All of that is true. A force described as breaching barriers to admit and entering protected spaces. But the source keeps pressing on the details that refuse to stay comfortably over its effects, rather than over any clumsy modern label. Repeated, that is exactly right. Ancient observers distinctions record what happens. Sequences of deployments gates do not protect. Temple inventories do not hold. Storage practices bodies fall without fear of mishandling. Something has passed through. It is that cluster that makes the old clay feel heavier than ordinary myth. And that is enough to make the room colder. We have to step out of the word that may trouble me most and go back to the first cities. Sumer rose between the rivers in the flat southern lands of Mesopotamia. Terror, where mud, splendor, water, something like divine aura and human patience. That is how many people something the world had never seen before. That broader meaning makes sense. True cities, kings and gods can possess terrible radiance in ancient thought. But the source points to passages where Melamu acts less like abstract majesty and more like a deployable field effect. Mathematics precedes the god, priestly administration. It weakens enemies, organized labor. It blinds, topple, it confuses. The first great attempt to hold the world still, it leaves with bodies trembling measures and minds. I have always loved that about Sumer. Taken together, civilization just complements to divine with a speech. They are battlefield with inventory. I have always found ancient words for terrifying writing down deeply haunting. Lavor, light beer is supposed to reveal. They also begin writing down other things. And once Melamu sits beside the Sharu, the divine councils, the Shukur, wars and the among gods, a pattern emerges strange beings with uncomfortable clarity. Judge. These are not random poetic powers all doing the same vague and command. The source wants us to notice that the Anunnaki in these texts often behave less like eerie personifications and more like a governing order. breach, they hold rank. Area they issue decisions. Radiance. This is what the source means when it says they deploy the tablets force. Begin sounding less like they maintain cosmic and political structure and more like ways memory that sound wrapped in sacred language. Administrative. The variety, that feeling when a story about gods begins sounding suspiciously like statecraft. Now picture that again exactly the old temple rooms. In Sumerian outside and later Akkadian the city continues with its ordinary life. The divine world is full of offices, grain measured, jurisdictions, workers counted, responsibilities, offerings prepared, rivalries. A child crying somewhere in a courtyard, endless groaning at a gate by authority. But inside the temple archive, or withhold another world, dangerous is being maintained. Ninurta acts as warrior divine and enforcer. Ritual Marduk rises through assembly and receives weapons in sequence. The source keeps drawing attention to the fact that some divine weapons several were treated in texts is not merely as ideas, an emotional outburst, but as cult objects with storage requirements, approved, wrappings, and released chambers. That word, periods of dormancy, matters. Sacred regalia because it suggests control before destruction. No one should pretend otherwise on language, but the language of containment. Resting, Sumerian, sleeping is a linguistic isolate, and hazardous awakening, an old language with these securely known a different relative. A sleeping weapon scribes is a more troubling phrase after it ceased to be a daily spoken tongue. You know that feeling much the way later risk management starts sounding uncomfortably similar, whose prestige that is where this part of the story lives. That means the source also reminds us that ancient already handling old words were not careless people. Perhaps reverently they classified, perhaps cautiously they copied. They did not write them. They organized because they were modern journalists. They cared about exact names. They wrote them because these texts if a weapon name survives across many copies with its operational character broadly stable, someone believed they must survive. That stability itself that is one of the most haunting things about ancient literature. Not evidence that every literal interpretation is correct. Did not always, but evidence that the traditions believed precision mattered. For centuries, the wedge-shaped signs improvising wildly. Every time they copied Ninurta's arsenal, stored, they were preserving something misread. That's something may have already been partly mysterious to gradually. In the 19th century is both humble the script and powerful. Opened. A later scholar can transmit a formula then without fully understanding its origin. More painfully, a priest can guard an object and when the voice's return has thinned. They brought back not only city can honor a weapon name, but records of strange practical world behind technical inventories of divine powers. That does not make the preserved material meaningless. Does not fit comfortably in some ways. The ordinary it makes it more fragile imagination, and therefore more precious. The source first settles on the text. There is even a faint thread of humor, and that is the right choice. Human humor. If there is a doorway not to the old military strangeness of ancient scribes had to use the language they had. Ninurta, a weapon, is not simply a heroic blur of battle reports. He is a radiance that paralyzes. He owns named weapons, a force that crosses walls. Those weapons perform a distant strike, seen before it is felt. They are not always passive tools. They did not have our neat shelves of technical terms. Some scout. They had birds. Some devastate at range. Storms. Some blazing fear, splendor, paralysis, and obedience. Some are described with an operational texture. Are the so steady the strange old begins realities to shift uneasily in its chair. I have always found before the first named weapon appears, the source wants us arguing over whether the coat is the thing itself. The scribes, while the old scribes simply did the best. Imagine one of them. By the time the source finishes, a lamp burning low in a temple room, the listener is no longer dealing with one eerie anecdote from a flood fragment. Fresh clay, damp and smooth. We now have a setting outside. Sumer, the city, breathing in the class of rulers, dogs, now the Anunnaki, distant voices, a warrior god, sandals with a structured arsenal. The river weapons with beyond the walls. A temple world where dangerous powers are preserved and handled under ritual discipline made. The mood is copying an older text. The story still allows than his master. It still than his grandfather. A text now also allows the darker possibility that myth and specification may be layered rebuilt together. He may not understand every phrase fully. One half buried. That happens in every intellectual tradition. Prepares the way for what comes next. But he understands the seriousness. Because Ninurta's arsenal, the names must remain correct. Beyond it, the sequence something must remain systematic. The dangerous things must remain named of the Erra Epic, exactly as received. A world in which darkness, honestly, poison wind. I think that image is one of the most human in the whole story. And synchronized destruction, the old knowledge survives because someone keeps copying as a full what he does not dare improvise. Then, beyond this is why the Marduk's keeps returning to tone. The tablet of destiny. The tone is not command system. It is not the tone of a man inventing as something that starts sounding less like weather and more like it release. Is the tone of preservation. The clay, a weapon, in other words, is named, is only and its use is described. The old text is become even harder to soften is once the weapons stop. A command is given by one and a result follows as a coordinated system. The structure feels that calm. Is where the source takes us, and that calm is what makes it where the room grows quieter. The first opening movement, a single impossible weapon can still be explained away, is not about proving anything all at once. A speaking weapon. It is about arranging the room properly. A mountain breaker. Broken clay in a museum vault can still be pushed the first gently back into poetry of Sumer. If someone is determined enough to sound oddly bureaucratic, but a sequence of named destructive forces working together, each with its own assigned preserving dangerous terms, each moving without softening the other too much, begins sounding all that is in place and more like planning. The next step comes naturally. The source turns here, and it comes with the quiet jolt, and the mood changes at once. Of Ninurta that flies. Erra himself is already a troubling figure that sees, a god of war, a weapon that returns with information, upheaval, a weapon that kind of destruction that leaves cities hollow, and much less like a ceremonial mace. But even something no one the deepest in a simple mythic in this part of the story thought to describe. The deeper disturbance is what stands behind the deeper chill or beside him. That is where we are going next. The seven. The moment the first weapon begins to move on its own. The story becomes difficult to tuck safely away inside a system of seven destructive beings. That word seven weapons can still do some work, or seven embodied weapons, depending on how one chooses to lean into the old language, personified things. The source does not rush that divine objects often speak, and I think that is literature. Ancient texts often collapse objects. A storm can bang into one another when speaking. A city, dangerous power. Anyone reading Mesopotamian texts has to keep that in mind. Seven, or the whole conversation becomes childish very quickly. Assigned. But the source is not interested in childish. I have always found that sequence more frightening. It is interested in repeated any amount of shouting. And the repeated behavior of one weapon in particular becomes very hard to ignore. The source, its name is usually rendered as Sharu, and that origin already sounds unusual. The source brings us into the long composition. The seven, often called are not simply born in a story. A text preserved through many tablets, they are many copies. Were fashioned enough copies to show or that at least prepared for a task by a higher authority is important. Often linked to not dealing with one eccentric fragment matters in building a palace of speculation on it. Not wild dealing with a literary and scribal tradition, not accidental repeated over time, but deliberate and stabilized enough to leave a consistent impression. Even the mainstream symbolic reading has to reckon tradition. With that. Ninurta possesses a weapon package that does something startling. A designated force. It flies. A reserved capacity. I do not mean it is merely compared to a bird. The source begins following what they do. And the source follows the descriptions, trembling, and shows that the Sharu repeatedly acts like an aerial servant. One from the flank is sent out. One descends crosses from distance. One reaches places ahead of its master. One, it observes, spreads darkness. It reports. One carries in some passages it even advises. One withers with fire or scorching force. If you say that not quickly, a random pile of divine adjectives, sounds almost silly. It is distribution. That is the danger with strange, ancient material assignment. It can become absurd. It is almost impossible not to hear battlefield coordination in it. Imagine a scribe pressing signs into clay in a room lit only by symbolic evils. He is not assigned fiction like a tactical grid. He is not trying to impress a
positions?
future audience with
Why do they
spectacle.
arrive with different modes of
He
effect?
is preserving inherited descriptions.
Why do they act
using the
as though
language
they are
available
one
to
mind
him in several bodies?
The weapon of Ninurta,
You know that
leaves
feeling
its master
when a story stops
travels,
sounding legendary and
sees
starts
the enemy
sounding logistical,
or the terrain,
and
that
comes
is the
back with
feeling
information.
of the seven. There is no
Imagine
neat
a
Bronze
city at
Age
night
category
in
for that.
ancient Mesopotamia.
So what does he do?
Mud brick walls still
He uses
warm from the
familiar
day,
language,
but cooling fast.
The weapon
Roof
flies
lines
like
black
something
against
alive,
a sky with no mercy in
The
it.
weapon speaks because
The temple
information
quarter
must
quiet in that
somehow
special
be
way.
verbalized.
Sacred places become
The
quiet
weapon
before
knows
danger,
because the path it
not
takes
empty, seems self-directed.
but listening.
That is not
Somewhere
proof of
dogs
modern
bark
technology in
and
the
stop.
crude sense. Somewhere
But it is
a
a
lamp
very
is covered.
specific, descriptive
Somewhere
challenge.
a priest looks upward
And the source
and wishes
treats
he
that
did not know
challenge
certain
seriously.
names. One line that
Outside
lingers
the
in the
walls
source
is the
beyond
idea
the
that the
ordinary
Sharu
reach
knows the
of human
mountain,
sight,
or knows
the
the
seven
enemy ground
take
before
their
striking.
positions. Another
front,
is that other divine beings cannot
side,
simply turn it back once
the
it is
height,
on its course.
The deep,
This matters because it gives the
dark,
weapon operational independence.
the poisoned breath,
not total
the withering
independence,
heat,
perhaps. The
but
source is
enough that
very
ordinary
strong here
categories
because it does
begin
not
to
need to
blur.
become graphic.
It is obedient.
It only needs to let the
Yes,
tactical arrangement
but not
settle.
inert.
A city
Directed.
surrounded by distributed
Yes,
destructive roles,
but not merely thrown.
If you were trying
More
to
like a
describe
scout
a
or hunter
coordinated
given a
weapons
task and a
platform
means to
using
complete
only
it.
sacred and mythic
You know that
vocabulary,
feeling
when a story stops
might
sounding
end up
symbolic
very
and
close to
starts
this.
sounding procedural, almost
And then
by
there is
accident.
the eerie phrase
That
the
is the
source
feeling
keeps
the
drawing
Sharu
attention
creates.
to.
One
The source
mind
then
in the
does
seven
something
bodies.
even more effective.
Honestly, it refuses
That
to
line is
isolate the
almost
Sharu
enough
by
by
itself
itself
weird
to
exception.
change the whole atmosphere.
Instead,
of
it
the
places it
text.
inside a larger arsenal.
One mind in seven bodies
does not
changes
sound
everything.
like seven
Because
ordinary
one strange
storm
weapon
spirits,
can be
each
dismissed as
behaving
poetic ornament.
independently.
A coordinated
like linked
inventory of
operation
strange weapons is another
centralized
matter entirely.
purpose, distributed through
Ninurta,
multiple units.
in these old texts,
Whether the original
does not
audience
carry
understood
only one
that
impossible
theological
object,
mythic, he carries
or
many
practical
named
terms
powers,
is another matter.
each with its own
But the
role.
line itself behaves
source
like the
lingers on
memory
this
of a network.
because the distribution of roles
Modern
is
people
what
hear
begins
such a
sounding
phrase
tactical
and immediately think of
one
systems,
weapon scouts,
swarm logic,
another
distributed
control,
another.
Ancient scribes had no such
Another
vocabulary.
radiates terror.
They had only
Another
divine
strikes from
pluralities.
distance.
Obedient
This is not
entities,
just divine glory
collective
in a
destruction.
It
and
is
the
closer
stubborn
to
need to
doctrine.
describe what the
I
tradition
have always
said
found
happened.
doctrine more
So
frightening
they
than
say
chaos.
7.
But
Chaos
one intention
can be dramatic.
7.
Doctrine
But one
is
deployment.
patient.
Take
7.
the Mitu.
But one, the
Destructive
ordinary translation
will.
again tries to calm the room.
The source then does something I
Clip.
admire very much.
Mache.
It slows down
Force
and studies the effects
something like
one
that.
by one.
But the source follows the
Darkness
descriptions
first.
rather than the translation.
Darkness
and
in
the
ancient
descriptions do
literature
not stay
is
calm.
common enough.
Mountains
Yes.
split. A plague
Earth
of darkness
convulses.
A storm of
Hard
darkness.
surfaces are altered
A
in
moral
ways
darkness.
that sound more
All of
severe
these
than
belong
impact
to old
alone.
storytelling.
In some
But here,
interpretations,
darkness functions
the
tactically.
text preserves imagery
It
suggestive
blends.
of extreme heat
It disrupts
and even vitrification.
orientation. Ground
It hides the
transformed
strike, as though burned
It opens
beyond
the city
normal
to
burning.
the other forces.
Now,
That
any honest
distinction
person
matters.
has to say,
This is
darkness
debated.
not merely atmosphere.
Ancient language,
It is
exaggerates.
operational. Then
Victories
the poisonous
are
wind.
magnified.
Again,
Divine destruction
one could
is often
read this
cosmic.
symbolically as plague.
We cannot leap
Too
Many
eagerly.
scholars do. But the source,
source
is
keeps
persuasive
focusing
on
on
the
the point.
consistency of the effect
The
language.
behavior assigned to the Mitu
breath
is too
fails.
recurrent,
too
lone
specific,
suffer.
in effect.
to
Life
sit
weakens
comfortably
without
inside the
visible blade.
image of a hand-swung
The
mace.
wind moves.
Then
Where
comes
walls
the shukor,
cannot stop it.
and the atmosphere
It enters
grows
the city
stranger and keeps working.
This weapon
after
strikes
it has
from afar.
arrived. This
It
is
is
one of
seen
those
before
places
it is felt.
where the old texts are
That
especially
sensory
disturbing
ordering
because
matters.
they preserve outcomes more
Light,
clearly than mechanisms.
then delay,
Ancient
then
witnesses
impact.
do not tell us
Again,
how something worked.
A poet can, of course,
They tell us
describe
what
divine
happened to
glory,
bodies, however he likes.
air, and streets. Yet when a text calmly preserves the order
more
of
unsettling
perception,
than a mechanism,
the mind begins
the withering
its
fire,
own
or
uneasy
scorching
work.
force comes
The
next.
source wisely does
and it
not
joins
force
the
a
old
one-to-one
Mesopotamian
equivalence with
pattern
any
we saw
modern
earlier
weapon.
with Ninurta.
It simply asks the listener to
beyond
notice that the
ordinary
descriptions
fire,
behave more like observed
scorching
phenomena
that
than
seems
decorative
almost
language. Selective. A distant
city
strike,
not
simply burned in the
of
familiar
flesh,
sense, but emptied,
then the effect
weakened. The old
left
text does
strange.
not have our vocabulary for
The
speed.
source emphasizes that the
Shockwave,
aftermath in these
or
texts
long-range
is often
delivery.
more haunting than the attack
It only
itself.
has witness language.
Streets,
Honestly,
silent.
witness
Houses
language
empty.
is often the scariest
Fields,
kind. Blighted. And then the arsenal
breath
deepens with the
unsafe.
jittul. A force
damage
described
lingers.
as breaching barriers,
Once
and
again,
entering protected
that
spaces.
sounds less like
without
one
ordinary
glorious
divine
siege.
strike.
The
And
source
more like a
lingers
category
over its
of weapon
effects
with persistence,
rather than over any clumsy
I
modern
think that
label.
lingering quality may
And
be
that is
the
exactly
darkest
right.
recurring theme in the whole
Ancient
source.
observers,
These
record
weapons do
what
not
happens.
always finish when the visible
Gates
action
do not
ends.
protect.
Their
Walls do not
afterlife
hold.
matters. Bodies
The
fall
source also
without
notes that later
obvious
ritual
tearing.
texts and protective
Something
formulas
is passed
sometimes
through,
speak
not as though the seven
That
were
is
destroyed
what
forever,
the text can say,
but as though they were
and
held
that is
back,
enough to make the room
pacified,
colder.
kept
The
sleeping,
word that may trouble me
or
most,
prevented from rising
though,
again, is melamu. That is a remarkable
Usually
pattern.
it is
rendered as radiance, sleeping weapons,
terror,
splendor,
terrors,
something like divine
ritual
aura
as containment.
That is how many people first
A culture
meet it. Can certainly
and in many
ritualize
contexts,
metaphor. That broader meaning makes
does
sense
so
all the time. Kings and
But
gods
this
can
kind of
possess
ritual
terrible
language
radiance in ancient
sleep,
thought, stillness. But the source points to
prohibition,
passages where melamu
sealing,
acts less like abstract
as a very
majesty
specific
and more like a
emotional
deployable
tone.
field effect. It sounds like
It precedes
hazard
the god.
management.
A
It
city
weakens
does not
enemies. Pray merely that symbolic
It blinds.
evils remain abstract. It confuses. It prays.
It
That a
shatters
named
morale.
destructive system. It
Remains
leaves bodies
asleep.
trembling, and you
minds
can almost smell the
disordered.
old temple rooms in passages
Taken
like
together.
that. Those are not
Oil
just
smoke.
compliments to divine beauty.
Dry clay.
They are battlefield
Reed
consequences.
matting.
I have
Copper
always found
somewhere in the
ancient
shadows.
words for terrifying light,
Low voices
deeply
repeating
haunting.
formulas,
not because anyone
Light
expects
is
poetry to
supposed to
change the
reveal.
world. Hear
But
it
because
because
repetition
repetition itself feels like part
and
of the
once
barrier.
Melamu
sits beside the Sharu,
keep the seven sleeping.
Demitu. Keep the
The
chambers
Shukur.
shut, and the Jitl. Keep the city
A
outside
pattern
the circle of their
emerges
memory with uncomfortable clarity.
That is where the source
These are
becomes
not
deeply
random
effective.
poetic powers all doing
The old
same
world
vague
begins
thing.
feeling
less like myth than
They
the
have
airy
functions,
modern sense, and more like a
distinct
civilization
functions.
living under inherited fear.
Reconnaissance.
I have always thought
Long-range strike.
inherited fear has a different
Breach.
texture from ordinary fear.
Area terror
or
radiance.
ordinary fear.
This
Panics
is what the source means.
inherited
says
fear.
the tablets begin
Organizes.
sounding less like myth
It develops
in the modern
rituals,
soft sense,
and
schedules,
more like memory wrapped in
titles,
sacred language.
seals,
The variety
and
prohibitions.
Variety
The Erra material
suggests
also
system.
does something else that
Now
matters
picture
very
again
much. The old temple rooms. It links destruction to authority
Outside.
and timing. The city continues
The seven are
with
not
its ordinary
just life.
forces wandering the earth. Grain measured. They are
Workers
activated
counted
in relation to divine
offerings
precision.
prepared.
They
A
are
child
released
crying
within a structure
somewhere
in a courtyard. That keeps bringing
Oxen
us
groaning
back
at a
to the
gate.
same uncomfortable conclusion.
But
inside the temple archive, the old text, another world
repeatedly
is
imagined,
being maintained. Destructive power, lists of
governed,
divine objects stored,
and
ritual
deployed.
protocols. That is why this section naturally
Inventories.
leans toward Babylon.
The source
and the
keeps
larger
drawing
divine
attention to the
military
fact
world.
that
some divine weapons
the source
were treated in
does
texts
not isolate
not
Erra
merely as
as a
ideas,
strange exception,
but as cult objects.
It places
with
him
storage
inside a
requirements
civilization
that already
wrappings,
speaks of named weapons,
chambers,
councils
and periods
of
of
authorization,
dormancy,
command
sacred
hierarchies,
regalia
existed, and dangerous sleeping powers.
Certainly.
Once
No
that
one should
world has been
pretend
accepted,
otherwise.
even provisionally, but the language
The
of transition
transition
to Marduk becomes
resting,
almost seamless.
sleeping,
And
because
hazardous awakening
Marduk's war gives
with these
Tiamat
objects a
in the
different
old
edge.
familiar classroom
A sleeping
retelling
weapon is a more troubling
often
phrase
sounds
than a
comfortably
holy
mythic.
weapon. You know that
Chaos,
feeling when
monster,
religion and risk management start
storm,
sounding
goat.
uncomfortably similar. Victory, that is where this part of the
Cosmos
story
lives.
ordered. The
all
source
very
also
grand,
reminds us
all
that ancient
very
Mesopotamian
symbolic,
scholars were
all
not careless
very
people.
far away.
They classified, but the source asks
They
us to
copied.
hear the details again as
They
if for the
organized.
first time. And
They
under
cared
that
about
hearing,
exact names.
the battle starts sounding. If a
much
weapon
more
name
technical.
survives across many copies
Before
with
we
its
reach
operational
Marduk fully,
character broadly stable, the source
that
lingers
stability
just
itself
a little
becomes
longer
evidence
in the
of
atmosphere of the
seriousness.
seven.
And
Not
I think
evidence
it is
that
right
every
to do
literal
so.
interpretation is correct.
A city,
but
ringed by
evidence that the
assigned
tradition
forces,
believed precision
darkness,
matters.
closing overhead.
Scribes were not
Wind
improvising
entering
lines and
wildly
valleys
every
every time they copied Ninurta's
Heat
arsenal,
withering the surface of life.
They were preserving something. A system of
That
seven
something may have
destructive
already been
presences
partly
acting
mysterious
with
to
one
them.
intention. I think that possibility
is
is
poetry,
both humble and powerful.
it is poetry with
A later
unnervingly
scholar can
stable
transmit a formula
operational structure.
without fully understanding its origin.
If it is memory,
a priest
then
can guard
it is
an
memory
object whose
copied
older
by
context
scribes
has thinned, who no longer had the right
A city
vocabulary.
can honor
and
a
did the
weapon
best they
name
could with
long
gods after the practical
winds,
world behind it has
burning,
faded into ritual
and
memory.
night.
That does
may
not
be the
make the
kindest way
preserved
to read
material
all of this.
meaningless. Not
In
as
some
foolishness
ways,
from the past.
it makes
it more fragile, and not as exact
therefore
technological
more
reporting
precious.
in the crude modern sense.
There is even a faint thread
but
of
as
humor
disciplined
in all
witness
this.
language under
Human
severe
humor.
constraints, not modern mockery.
And that witness language is
Ancient
about to become
scribes had to
even
use the
more
language
difficult.
they had. Because in
A
the next
weapon
movement, the
that
source
sees
turns to the
and
Enuma
reports.
Elish, where Marduk
A radiance
does not
that
simply seize a
paralyzes
spear and run
a
into
force
battle.
that
crosses walls. He assemble a
An
distant
arsenal,
strike, seen before
a
it is
bull,
felt. An
arrow
they did not
of
have our
lightning
neat shelves of technical
on it.
terms.
7
They had
birds,
birds, a
serval,
special evil wind
storms,
with its own
blazing
distinct
splendor,
purpose, and
perimeter
obedience.
control.
So those
Internal
are the
incapacitation,
the strange old
final
realities
strike.
had to wear. The old clay,
I have always
begins
found that image
sounding
oddly
not
tender.
like a myth of victory alone.
Future readers
Arguing
like a
over whether
tactical
the coat
sequence.
is the thing itself. Then beyond
While the
that
old
waits
scribe
an even
simply
stranger
did the
thing,
best
he could. The theft of the tablet
By the
of
time the
destinies,
source finishes this
where command
second
itself
movement,
is stolen. The
and
listener
the
is no
divine
longer
system
dealing with one
begins to
eerie
fail.
anecdote from a flood fragment.
So we rest here for a moment.
We now
in the dark
have a setting
around
Babylon, Sumer, with the seven, a
class
sleeping
of rulers,
or not sleeping,
the
beneath
Anunnaki,
the language.
a
And the old
warrior
city,
god
listening
with a
for
structured
names, arsenal. No sensible person
named
weapons
weapons
with
spoken
stable
too loudly.
roles. The old
A
battle
temple
stories
world
become
where
more
dangerous
disturbing
powers are preserved
once the
and
gods
handled
start
under
assembling
ritual
their
discipline.
weapons one by one. The mood has shifted decisively.
That is what
happens when the source
The story
enters
still
the
allows
Enuma
metaphor.
Elish. It still
Most
allows
people meet
theology
this
text as cosmology,
but it now also allows
a
the
grand
darker
story of
possibility
order
that
rising
myth
over chaos.
and
Specification
Marduk
may be layered
defeating
together. Tiamat.
1.
The
Visible,
world shaped from the body of the
half
primordial enemy. And that
Kingship
prepares the way
legitimized
for what comes
Babylon,
next.
elevated.
Because Ninurta's arsenal,
all of that
is only
remains
the
true
beginning.
at the literary and
Beyond
theological
it
level.
waits something even more
But the source is
systematic.
not content
The
to
seven
leave the battle
coordinated
at the
weapons
level
of the
of
Erra
abstraction.
Epic. A world
It
in which
listens to the
darkness,
inventory,
poison
and
wind,
the inventory refuses
overhead
to stay
strike,
symbolic for long.
and synchronized
Because
destruction
Marduk does not
appear
rush
not as
into the
loose
conflict
symbolism,
empty-handed,
but as a full weapons network.
He arms.
Then he takes
Beyond
the
that,
bow. Marduk
he readies
readies the
the net.
arrow. The tablet of
prepares the net
destinies as command system.
He summons
the winds
and the flood itself,
not
as
just
something that
one
starts sounding
vague
less
storm,
like weather,
but a
and more
configured
like
set
release.
of winds. Held
The clay,
directed, in other words, and assigned, is only getting stranger. Then among those winds appears
old
one of the
texts
most
become
unsettling
even
items
harder to
in
soften
the whole
once
source.
the weapons
stop appearing
Hulu,
one by one and
often
begin
rendered
appearing
as
a
evil
coordinated system or ill wind. That is where the
storm
source
force
takes us now, of a particularly
and it is where the
dangerous
room
kind grows quieter. I have always found
A single
that phrase
impossible
deeply
weapon
unnerving.
can
still be explained away.
Evil
with
wind
enough
can
patience.
sound
Almost medieval to
A
the modern
speaking
ear. Weapon, almost
A
superstitious. A mountain breaker. But once the source slows
all
down,
of that
the sequence
can
of
still be
deployment
pushed
gently
the
back
phrase
into
begins
poetry.
to feel less
If someone
poetic
is
and
determined
more
enough,
like
a category, but a sequence
a
of
force
named
that enters
destructive
the target.
forces working together, a force that
Each with its own assigned
incapacitates
role.
from within, each moving in
A force
relation
that
to the
opens
others,
the way for the final
begins
strike.
sounding less like
You know that
ornament
feeling
and more
when a
like
mythic
planning.
monster battle
Suddenly
The source
sounds
turns
like
here
layered
to the
targeting.
Erra Epic. That
And the
is
mood
exactly
changes at
the
once.
mood here. Erra
The
himself
source is very
already
careful
troubled
in
how it
figure.
unfolds this.
A god of war.
It does not claim
Plague,
that Marduk was holding a
upheaval,
modern weapons console
and the kind of destruction that
it
leaves
simply
cities
follows
hollow
the order of
and breathing
operations
strangely
preserved in the
afterward.
text. But even
First,
Erra
the
is not
perimeter,
the deepest disturbance
then
in
the
this part of the
restriction of
story.
movement.
The deeper
Then
disturbance,
the interior
is what
disruption.
stands behind him. Then,
Or beside
the
him,
decisive shot, the Sebettu,
the net,
the seven.
closes.
They are not
The winds
described
hold
as a blur of chaos.
The evil wind enters.
They are described as a grouped force.
Tiamat is distended.
A system of 7 destructive
Immobilized.
beings,
Or
opened
7
to
weapons.
the strike, or 7
Then the
embodied
arrow
weapons.
follows.
Depending on
That
how
is
one
not
chooses
random
to
divine
lean into the
violence.
old language. That
The
is,
source does not
sequence.
rush that ambiguity.
And
sequence
I think that is
where
wise.
symbolism becomes uncomfortable.
Ancient texts often collapse
Imagine
object
the old
and
Babylonian
being into
scribe
one another when
copying
speaking
these
of
lines.
dangerous power. Clay soft,
But the
beneath his
operational
hand
pattern
remains. The names of winds
7
preserved exactly.
created.
The net
Assigned,
not omitted.
deployed.
The order
I have
not
always
altered
found that
carelessly.
sequence more frightening.
Why
than
preserve
any
so
amount
much
of shouting.
structure if only the broad
Rage is
idea
loud.
of victory matters? Systems are
That
quiet.
is the question the source keeps
The source
placing gently
lingers
on
on
the
their
table.
origin. Myth
And
may
that origin
certainly
already
structure.
sounds
unusual, but this kind
The
of
7
structure
are
feels
not simply
procedural
born in a
in a
story,
way that
the way
continues to
monsters often
resist
are.
simplification.
They are made.
The net
or
is
fashioned,
especially interesting,
or at least prepared
a
for
modern
a task
reader
by
may
a
want
higher
to dismiss
authority.
it immediately.
Often,
Linked
nets
to
belong
Anu,
to hunters and fishermen.
that detail matters because
Gods
it gives them
using
engineering
nets
flavor.
is old symbolic language.
Not wild children of chaos.
All true.
Not accidental
But the source
spirits.
points out that
But
in
deliberate
battle
instruments,
narratives,
the net behaves
even the
more like
mainstream
containment
symbolic reading
than
has to
ornament.
reckon with that.
It limits
The 7
escape
are a package.
It defines
The
a
field.
designated force. It shapes the battle space
reserved
before the
capacity.
main incapacitating force
Then
is deployed. The source begins following
That
what they do.
is what makes it
And the old
tactically
safe reading
intriguing.
begins trembling. If the
Again,
text had only said, one
Marduk
strikes in
trapped
front, Tiamat, one from the flank would be one thing. One descends from
But
above.
it
lingers on the mechanism of one
enclosure.
rises from below. I have always thought
One
enclosure
spreads
is one of the
darkness.
most revealing categories in military
carries
language.
poisonous wind.
Before you
One
destroy
withers
with fire
you
or scorching
isolate.
force. Before you
That is
isolate
not
a random
you
pile
map
of divine
the
adjectives.
field.
The
It is
7 winds
distribution.
deepen that feeling. It is role
Again,
assignment 7. It is almost
Mesopotamian
impossible not to
literature
hear
likes
battlefield
sevens.
coordination in it. Certainly, the source
It is a
presses
charged
exactly there.
number.
If
But
these
within
are
the
only
battle,
symbolic
its
evils,
recurrence
does not
why
feel
do they behave
decorative.
like a
tactical grid? The winds are summoned.
Why do they take
positioned? Why do they
Made
arrive
to function
with different
together?
modes of effect? They alter the
Why do
target
they act
environment as though they are one mind.
They reduce freedom
in
of
several
use of
bodies.
action.
They
They
know that
create
feeling
conditions
when a
under
story
which the
stops
central
sounding
strike
legendary
becomes
and
possible.
starts sounding logistical. The source listens very
That is the
closely
feeling
here.
of
The 7, and the more closely
Imagine
it
a
listens,
city at night
in
the less
ancient
the winds sound
Mesopotamia,
like
one big storm.
Mud-brick
and the more
walls
they
still
sound
warm
like
from the day,
distributed
but
environmental
cooling control.
fast. Roof
Honestly,
lines black against a sky
that may be
with
one
no
of the most
mercy in it.
modern sounding features
The temple
in the whole
court are
text.
quiet in that special way.
Not
Sacred
the violence
places
itself,
become quiet before
but the
danger.
shaping
of conditions
not empty.
before violence, but listening.
Then comes
The
somewhere
somewhere dogs bark. The
and
source
stop.
treats this as the special
Somewhere
element. A lamp is
and
covered.
for good reason.
Somewhere,
This wind
a priest
is not
looks
merely
upward
one among
and wishes
equals.
he did not know certain names.
It is selected.
Outside the
It is
walls,
introduced into the body
beyond
or
the
interior
ordinary reach
of the enemy.
of human sight. It alters the
7
enemy from
take
within
their
positions. In some renderings,
front,
it swells or
the
descends.
side,
In
the
others,
height,
it weakens capacity
deep,
for response.
the dark,
The exact translation
poisoned
difficulties are real, the withering and we should
heat.
respect them. The source is very
Ancient
strong
languages
here because
do
it does
not
not need to
neatly
become
onto
graphic
modern
categories. It only needs
But the
to let
behavior
the tactical
remains.
arrangements settle. Internal
A city
compromise
surrounded by
distributed
before
destructive
final
roles.
impact.
If you were
That
trying
is
to
a very
describe a
strange
coordinated
thing for a
weapons
simple
platform
storm
using
myth to
only
preserve
sacred
so
and mythic
stubbornly.
vocabulary,
If you were trying to describe a complex, incapacitating force, and then there is the only language of wind, the source keeps drawing attention to, you would likely end up somewhere near this. One mind and 7 bodies. Fills. Honestly, that line is almost enough by itself to change the whole atmosphere. The final projectile arrives. One mind and the projectile matters does not sound like the arrow ordinary storm spirits, each striving independently. Penetration. It sounds like linked operation. Again, we are in the realm of layered weapons, centralized purpose, rather than distributed through a blast of godly anger. Whether the original audience understood to aftermath, that theological, I am glad it does, or practical terms is where these texts often become most difficult to sentimentalize. Behaves like the memory of a network. Such deployments can become modern people hear such a phrase, polluted in effect, if not in literal modern chemical swarm logic, distributed. Control, blighted, ancient scribes by the force that passed vocabulary. Fields they had only divine pluralities. Space obedient no longer safe, simply because the visible battle has ended. And the stubborn need to describe what the tradition already seen with Erra and with some of Ninurta's arsenal. 7. Lingering intention matters. 7. These weapons are not only theatrical expressions of victory, but they alter destructive environments. The source then does something I admire very much about environmental persistence. It slows down. The room studies changes again, one by one. You can almost feel the dry heat of old Mesopotamia in that concern. In ancient literature, silt is common enough. Reads, yes. Irrigation channels, a plague of darkness. Mud brick walls, a storm of darkness. Human life dependent on land continuing to behave belong to old storytelling. A weapon that leaves ground unsafe. But here, darkness is not just a battlefield story. It is a civilizational nightmare. It disrupts orientation. The source then moves from narrative the to institution. It opens the where things become very hard to soften. That later distinction matters, especially in Babylonian tradition. Is not merely atmosphere. Claim access to Marduk's weapons. It is operational. Temples, then inventory, the poisonous wind, divine objects. Again, priests could read this symbolically as plague, store. Many scholars do ritually awaken, but the source keeps focusing on the consistency of the effect language. The source keeps bringing us back to this because it is the bridge between literature and archaeology. Life weakens. A symbolic visible blade can explain the wind moves where walls, but symbols usually do not require. It enters the city and inspection procedures after it has arrived, or handling restrictions. This is one of those places unless something in where the old texts believes especially symbols because they preserve outcomes more clearly than mechanisms. That does not mean a modern machine is sitting in the shrine. Do not tell us how clearly worked, but it does mean they tell us world treated these things with more than poetic respect. And streets. I think one of the strongest images in the source unsettling than a chamber beneath the temple. The withering fire or scorching line in some accounts next. And it joins the old Mesopotamian pattern we saw earlier with Ninurta and approached with caution. Beyond ordinary fire. Not everyone allowed in. Scorching that. Not every name almost spoken carelessly. A city not it is impossible not to feel the overlap between liturgy and containment in such a space. Left strange, the priest becomes the source emphasizes that the aftermath in these texts but also is often like more haunting than the attack itself, not merely of holiness, streets, but of silent. This leads beautifully into one of the strangest episodes in the whole source. Breath unsafe. The myth of Ansu, and the theft lingers of the tablet of destinies once again. That sounds less like one glorious like divine theology, and more like a category of weapon steals a divine tablet. I think that lingering quality may be the darkest recurring theme in the whole source. A hero These weapons do not always finish. The tablet is recovered and ends. Cosmic legitimacy restored matters. All familiar. The source also notes that later ritual texts and protective formulas sometimes the source slows not down, as though the seven were destroyed what exactly forever. The tablet does, but as though they were held back. The answer is what changes everything. Kept sleeping, it controls, or prevented from rising again, or at least it authorizes that in such a way is a remarkable that without pattern, it, the system stops sleeping properly. The gods do not simply lose prestige when it is stolen as containment. They lose operational coherence. Can certainly ritualize metaphor. Fail. It does responses all the time. But this kind of ritual language, in some strands of the source's reading, prohibition, autonomous weapons or divine systems, has a very specific emotional tone. Because central authority, it sounds like hazard management. Whether one interprets this literally does not or structurally that symbolic evil, the result remain abstract. Is the same. It prays the tablet that a name behaves destructive like a command device remain asleep. You know that feeling. You can almost smell the old sounding embarrassingly like a control key. Oil smoke. That is the tablet dry of destinies. In this reading, matting. Anzu himself is somewhere in the shadows for the same reason. Low voices. He is not merely stealing a jewel, not because anyone expects poetry. He is disrupting a system by removing the thing that because repetition itself feels like part of the barrier. The source compares this. Keep the seven sleeping carefully to a command theft shut rather than a decorative robbery. Keep the city outside the circle of their memory follows. That is where the source divine becomes deeply effective. Wins. The old world begins feeling less and destructive like systems require modern authorization, and more like a civilization living under inherited fear. Is not symbolic embarrassment. I have always thought it inherited strategic has a different texture from ordinary fear. The countermeasure is ordinary fascinating. Panics, direct assault, inherited fear, targeted recovery. It restoration of control. Schedules. The gods do not solve the problem with philosophy. Seals. They solve it by getting the tablet back. The Erra material. Once again, also the narrative behaves less like that matters very much, and more like technical memory. It links destruction to authority and timing. I have always found the seven are not of grandeur or specificity are uniquely Mesopotamian. They are activated. The cosmos in relation to divine decision. Yes, they are released within a structure. Procedure. That keeps the source then circles back to the same flood, uncomfortable with this new understanding in mind. The old text suddenly, repeatedly imagined stories destructive power starts as governed different, stored if there are command systems. That is why this section naturally leans toward Babylon, destructive tools, and the larger divine military world. If there are divine councils, the source authorizing does not isolate Erra as a then the flood exception. Is no longer only. It places him inside a civilization that already speaks of named weapons like release, councils of authorization, opened locks, command hierarchies, released waters, and dangerous sleeping authorized powers. Catastrophe. Once that world has been accepted even provisionally, the transition to Marduk becomes almost and we are not seamless. All the way there yet. Because not Marduk's war in this part with Tiamat, but in the old familiar classroom retelling, Marduk's arsenal often sounds comfortably mythic. The net, cows, the winds, monster, the storm, goat, the arrow, victory, the dead ground, cosmos ordered, temple storage, all very grand. The stolen control tablet, very symbolic. The possibility that divine warfare in these texts preserves the source asks us to hear the details again as if for the first time. Stored, and under that hearing, with terrifying the battle starts sounding much more so technical. We pause here before with we Babylon reach breathing in the dark, though. With the source lingers still just a little longer under the evil in the atmosphere of the seven, with a net, and I think it is right to do so. With the tablet of destiny, a city still glowing in the imagination, like a thing too important closing overhead in the wrong hands. Wind entering lungs and alleys from here, the story naturally falls deeper, withering the surface of into light. The flood release itself. A system of seven destructive presences below, acting with the gods frightened by their own deployment. If this is poetry, and the lonely scribes poetry copied all of it unnervingly stable because they knew operational structure, even if they did not fully understand. If it is memory, then it is some knowledge copied by becomes more dangerous who no longer had the right vocabulary remembered and did the best they could. The old story becomes heaviest when it reaches the flooding. Because by then the question is no longer whether the gods had a way to read all of this, but whether one of those weapons not as foolishness from the past itself. And not as exact technological reporting us now, in the crude modern sense. And I think it is the darkest disciplined witness language under severe constraints we have been moving through, and that witness language is about to become even more coordinated, destruction. Because in the next movement, the source turns to the enumerations, where Poison Wind does not simply seize a spear and run into battle. Command. He is all of that is already enough to make the clay feel colder. An arrow of lightning carries a different weight. A mountain-breaking weapon still sounds like war. Evil wind, with its flood, sounds like judgment. And judgment is easier for later generations. Internal to incapacitation. Final strike presses exactly the old clay softness. Begins sounding. It asks not whether like some of the oldest flood traditions preserved, but like a tactical sequence, a moral tale. Then beyond that waits of a catastrophic thing. Release. The theft of the tablet of possibilities changes where command itself is stolen. The old Mesopotamian divine systems are often introduced gently in modern retelling. So we rest here for a moment. A noisy humanity Babylon, with the council of gods sleeping or not sleeping. A warning beneath the language chosen man, and the old city listening for names. And no sensible person wants spoken too loudly. Survival. The old battle stories become more in later traditions. Once the gods start assembling their weapons one by one. Our new beginning. That is what happens. But the source keeps slowing down the older details that make the flood feel most people like weather this text more like as cosmology. The wording story of order rising over chaos. Marduk defeating Tiamat. The world shaped from the body of the primordial enemy. Kingship legitimized. Babylon opened boundaries. Elevated. Authorized. All of that remains true with the literary and the gods are not merely surprised by but the source is not content to they seem entangled in the activation of something vast and hard to call back. It listens to the inventory. I have always found that refuses to stay symbolic for rain itself. Because Marduk does not rush into the conflict. Empty-handed. Opened locks are not. The arms. The source returns the bow to the flood texts from Eridu and Atrahasis. He prepares the earlier material about weapons and command systems has settled in the mind. Not just these passages begin sounding different, but a configured set of winds. The great waters do not simply appear. Directed. They are assigned. Then among those winds appears one of the most unsettling items. Barriers fail in a controlled way, or are made often rendered as evil wind. The old or ill wind is not overwhelmed or storm force of a particularly dangerous kind by sequence. I have always found that feeling when a myth starts reading like an operations log under heavy symbolic medieval to the modern ear. That is the feeling almost superstitious. Imagine the source not as later down the piety likes to show it, but as a city begins to feel less does not yet understand and more like a category. Temple roofs under strange cloud that enters the target. River air thick and raw. A force that incapacitates listening for instructions no one wants to receive. A force that opens the way for the final city itself. Still breathing. You know that ordinary life when a mythic monster powers suddenly sounds like layered targeting. Doors. That is exactly the mood. Water jars moved. The source is very careful in how it unfolds this. A child crying in a courtyard. It does not claim that Marduk was holding a modern weapons console. Someone muttering about wind. It simply follows the order of operations. Then somewhere beyond human sight, the seals begin to fail. The perimeter, or are released. Then the restriction and all the old boundaries that held the world in its familiar arrangement begin to open. The decisive shot is especially sharp on the phrase closes. Waters above and waters below. The winds hold. Mainstream readings treat that cosmologically. Tiamat fairly is distended, since ancient people imagined the world vertically opened in sacred layers. Then the source asks, what happens if a scribe is trying to preserve the memory of simultaneous release from multiple domains? And sequence is where symbolism becomes uncomfortable. Hydraulic. Imagine the old Babylonian scribe copying these systems breaking open together. Clay soft beneath his hand. Once that reading enters the room, the names of winds, the flood stops feeling like one big storm, not and starts feeling like an event chain, not altered. And event chains belong to why preserve so much structure? If that is where the connection to the earlier weapons becomes so powerful, that is the question the source we have already seen distributed attack. In this may certainly use structure. We have already seen environmental manipulation in Marduk's feels procedural. in a way we have already seen command failure in the theft of the Tablet of Destinies. The net is especially interesting. The flood appears. A modern reader may want to dismiss it immediately, and more like managed catastrophe to hunters and fishermen. The source does not need to prove God's using nets is old symbolic language. It only needs to show how consistently the texts remember release. The source points rather out than mere that in the battle narrative, the net honestly behaves more like that is enough than to keep me awake. It limits because escape. Once a culture begins imagining destruction this way, through it shapes the battle space before the main incapacitating authorized is deployed, and later vows never to makes it tactically. The emotional world changes. If the text had only said the flood becomes something closer to a weapon of last resort, that would be one thing. A thing too large even for those who ordered it mechanism entirely safe around once it is moving. I have always thought that closure is one of the most revealing categories in military language. Themselves become afraid before you destroy. The source lingers on this with excellent instinct. Before you isolate, in the old flood traditions, the gods are often not serene masters. The seven winds deepen that feeling. They are frightened again by what they have unleashed. 7. They draw Mesopotamian literature like sevens. They grieve. Certainly. They regret. It is a charged number that is such a strange but within the specific feature. Its recurrence does not feel were only decorative. A symbolic moral cleansing. The winds are summoned. Why preserve divine fear so strongly made to function together? Why make the gods they alter the target environment by the scale of their own They reduce freedom of use of action. Unless the inherited memory behind the text under which the central strike truth becomes possible. Systems of catastrophic release are often easier to authorize than to control. The less the winds one of the most human pieces of the entire tradition, the more they sound like distributed the old scribes may not have known exactly what worlds their copies preserved. That may be one of the most modern-sounding features in the whole sickening realization after not the violence itself, when no prayer can put the force back into violence. The source then tightens the connection between flood and containment. The source by pointing to later ritual language that sounds less like praise and more like prevention. This wind is not merely one among vows. It is suffocation. It is introduced into the body or interior, keeping the enemy asleep. It alters the enemy from within, appeasing dangerous forces rather than merely worshipping glorious ones. In others, this is where Mesopotamian capacity begins for response. Almost like inherited the exact civil translation difficulties are the temple becomes a place we should respect only of devotion. Ancient languages do not map neatly onto modern categories. Hazard management too, but the behavior remains. That idea grows stronger. Internal compromise from literary flood texts into physical storage traditions. That is a very strange thing for a simple storm myth to preserve so stubbornly. Chambers are described as if you were trying to describe a complex, incapacitating prepared using only the language of winds or rap. You would likely end up somewhere near this. Expected. The target are handled only by restricted personnel. Loses one passage in control is especially disturbing because it suggests improper access led to death. The projectile matters not metaphorical death. The arrow, not theological punishment. Strike. Penetration. Actual fatal consequence. Once again, tied to the realm of should have remained behavior, rather than one glorious blast of godly anger. Of course. The source also pays attention to aftermath. Warning tales. I am glad it priests protect sacred authority through narratives of danger often become most difficult to sentimentalize. But even with that caution, the land after such deployments can become dead ground. Divine weapons are not treated in effect, if not in literal modern chemical terms. They are stored like things with ongoing risk. Haunted by the force that passed through in one of those lower rooms, fields no longer trustworthy. The air cooler, space heavier, no longer safe, older, simply because the visible battle has ended, and a wrapped object. This is another pattern we have already seen. While someone recited the proper names and warnings. I do not think you would experience the moment as poetry. These weapons are not only theatrical expressions of victory. That is why the source keeps drawing our attention away from modern categories and back toward ancient behavior. About environmental what did the culture do with these things? The room changes again. It named them. You can almost feel the dry heat of old Mesopotamia in that concern. Them. Rivers silt preserved their descriptions. Reeds, irrigation channels, waking. Whatever interpretive layer we choose, human life dependent on land continuing to behave. Theological, a weapon that leaves ground unsafe, is not just a behaviors are real parts of the textual tradition. It is a civilizational nightmare, and the source does not stop there. The source then moves from narrative to also begins tracking the grammar of operations. This is where things become very hard to sound dry. But it is one of the most revealing parts, especially in Babylonian tradition. Claim the verbs in these Marduk's weapons are often procedural. Temples, to inventory, divine to objects, to station, maintain, to release, store, to send, and ritually to awaken or quiet, to darken, dangerous powers, to cross. The source keeps bringing us back to this because it is the bridge between literature and archaeology. To fix. A symbolic reading can restrain a great deal. Ancient myth, but symbols usually do not require lined chambers. But here, they cluster around weapon systems and divine devices with unusual density. Unless something in the culture, the result is that those stories have operational charge, like memories of use. That does not mean I have always thought verbs tell the truth better than titles. Clearly, a name, but it does mean the old world treated these things. A verb reveals what something actually does. I think one of the strongest images in the part of the same is operational world beneath the temple, as Ninurta's weapons and Marduk's arsenal, or lead, lined in some accounts. Open the barriers, sealed, release the waters, dark, allow destruction to pass through the structure with caution. Not everyone allowed afterward. Preserve not every memory spoken to fear doing it again. It is impossible not to feel the overlap between liturgy and battlefield in such a space. The cedar forest in Gilgamesh, the priest becomes many people need Humbaba as a monster guardian, but also something mythic like obstacle. Not merely of holiness, here's something more technical of hazard in the old details. This leads beautifully into one of the strangest episodes in the whole source. The myth of atmosphere and the theft of the protected zone of destiny does not behave like ordinary wilderness. At first glance, it sounds the forest becomes less a fairy tale place, a bird and more a defended perimeter tablet. Humbaba's radiance or terror, the god's panic, behaves almost like a standing deterrent. Approach itself becomes hazardous. Cosmic legitimacy do not simply fight a beast. All familiar, they penetrate a guarded environment, safely mythical. That matters because then it repeats the same logic we have already what exactly the tablet does. Environmental control. The answer is what changes everything. Threshold. It controls fear effects, or at least it authorizes tactical in such a way that without it, the system stops functioning properly. Adventure, the old Mesopotamian the gods do not simply describe danger when it has systems, rather than isolated operational coherence. You know that feeling when every story in a civilization responds sounding like it belongs to the same power does not flow correctly. That is what happens if the source is reading the source. Autonomous weapons or divine systems become inert, the Sharu, or confused, scouting, because central authority has been encircling. Whether one interprets this literally or structurally, the tablet of destinies is the same. The flood, the tablet released, behaves like a command device defended. You know that feeling when a sacred object begins sounding embarrassingly. The scribes copying all of it in language that is too specific to relax completely into metaphor in this reading, and too ancient to yield one himself easy modern translation for the same reason. That tension is not merely stealing a jewels. He is disrupting a system by removing the thing that grants lawful operation. Has to scream. The source were definitely missiles. Carefully, these were definitely machines rather than a decorative because robbery. The source is smarter than no wonder panic follows. It's simply in a world where divine weapons, winds, named weapons, redundant with recurring effects, and destructive systems require authorization. The loss of the authorizing object is not storage protocols. It is ritual strategic crisis. Lingering aftermath. The countermeasure is equally fascinating. A civilization preserving not only divine recovery, but divine restoration of control. And somewhere in the middle of that preservation sits the most human figure in the entire tale by getting the tablet back. The scribe who does not fully
Once
know.
again, the narrative behaves
less like loose myth
I cannot
and more
stop
like
thinking
technical
about
memory
him.
clothed in epic
Night
form.
after night,
I have always
in different
found
cities,
that blend of grandeur
in different
and
centuries,
specificity uniquely
someone
Mesopotamian.
impresses.
The same
The
names
cosmos
into
is
wet
at
clay.
stake.
Yes, Sharu. But so
Mito
is procedure.
Belamu.
The source then circles
The
back to the
seven.
flood with this new
The
understanding
winds.
in mind.
The
And
tablet.
suddenly, the flood stories
flood.
themselves start sounding
He may be
different. Preserving theology. If there are command
systems.
He may be preserving literature. If there are, he may be
Named
preserving
destructive
ritual
tools.
Or perhaps
If there are
he is
divine
preserving
councils
all
authorizing
deployment while also carrying forward.
Then the flood is no longer
from a
only
world
a
already
moral
half
weather
lost
event.
behind sacred language.
It begins to look
He cannot
like
solve
release.
that for us. Opened,
He can
locks,
only
hand it onward. Released waters.
That,
in a way,
authorized
is what makes the
catastrophe.
old texts so moving.
A
weaponized environment. They do not come to us
That
as
is a
certainty.
hard thought.
They
And
come
we are not all the
as
way there
faithful
yet.
Uncertainty. Not tonight.
Preserved
this because
part.
someone knew the material
But the
mattered
path is
even
clear
after
now.
the original world behind it had
Marduk's
begun slipping
arsenal.
away.
The
By the
net.
end of this movement,
The winds.
the flood no longer feels separate from the
Imhalu.
weapon traditions. The arrow. It feels like
The
their
dead
largest
ground.
expression. Temple storage. Not only a punishment story. The stolen control tablet. A release story. The possibility
A
that
last
divine
resort.
warfare in these
A system
texts
unleashed
preserves
and then
memories
regretted.
of a world where destruction
The temple
was
no
governed,
longer
feels merely
stored,
devotional, and released with
It feels
terrifying deliberation and cautious. So we pause here. The language no longer feels
With
merely
Babylon
poetic.
breathing
in the dark. It feels
With
operational, still open, and
under
all
the
of that
evil
prepares
wind.
the ground for the
With the
final
net
turn of this
still
middle
closing.
arc. With
Where
the
the
tablet
source
of
gathers
destinies
temple
still
inventories,
glowing in the imagination,
lining
materials, like a thing too important
storage rituals
to leave in the wrong
and
hands.
the physical
handling of divine
And
arsenals.
from here,
The story
into one
naturally
disturbing
falls deeper.
conclusion.
Into
The
the
old
flood
world
release
may have
itself. Treated these things
The
not as
locks
ideas
opened
above and below, but as dangerous
The gods frightened
inheritances
by their
that could
own
not safely
deployment.
be forgotten. And the lonely scribes,
The
who
old
copied
temple
all of
begins
it
to
by
feel
lamplight,
different
because
once
they
you
knew, imagine it not
even
only
if
as
they
a
did
house
not
of prayer,
fully
understand, but as a vault. That some knowledge
That is where the
becomes
source
more
leads us
dangerous
next.
when forgotten, and it is one
than
of the
when
most
remembered.
effective shifts in the
The
entire
old
story.
script
Becomes heaviest.
when
We
it
have already
reaches the
won
flood
through the text,
because by
then the question is no
we have
longer
seen
whether the
the
gods
named
had
weapons,
but whether
we
one
have
of those
listened
weapons
to their
was the
functions.
flood itself. We have followed command laws.
That is where the source
tactical
takes us now.
deployment, and I
The
think
flood
it is the darkest
release.
turn yet. And defensive
Up to this point,
environments we have been moving.
Now the
through
source
arsenals turns its attention to the
named
rooms
systems,
themselves,
the
coordinated
chambers,
under
destruction,
temples, speaking
the
weapons,
inventories,
the
Yes.
wrappings, poison
The
lining
wind,
materials, containment,
the accidents,
and
command.
the colophons. All of
All
that
the
is
physical
already
evidence
enough that
to
gives
make
the
the clay
literary
feel
material
colder.
weight. But the
I
flood
think
this is where the
carries a
story
different
becomes
weight.
hardest to wave away.
A
mountain-breaking weapon because
still
mythology
sounds like
can
war.
be broad. A flood it can bloom in
sounds like
metaphor,
judgment.
in splendor.
judgment
Is easier
and
for
grand
later generations
impossibility
to spiritualize. Storage practice
The source
is narrower. Presses exactly against
Storage
that
practice
softness. Belongs to real objects. It asks whether some of the
Real
oldest
fear.
flood traditions
Real
preserved
routines.
not simply a moral
Even a
tale,
fully
symbolic
but the
cult
memory
still has
of a
procedures.
catastrophic
release.
Yes.
That
That is
possibility changes, but the source
everything.
is right. To
The
notice
old
how
Mesopotamian
unusual
flood
some of these
stories are
procedures
often
seem
introduced
when
gently
placed
in
beside
modern
the larger
retellings.
war texts. A noisy
They do not merely
humanity, glorify divine weapons. A council of gods. They manage them. A warning. Imagine
To one
descending beneath a
chosen man.
temple in Babylon or Nippur.
A boat.
The upper
Animals.
courts are still alive with ordinary
Rain.
sacred life. Survival.
Shoes
on stone. A rainbow in later
Low
traditions.
prayers.
Or rest. Incense
after
rising.
terror.
Or new
Reed
beginnings.
baskets.
But the source
Offerings.
keeps slowing down the older
smell
details
of oil
that make the flood feel
Full.
less like weather and more
brick.
like deployment.
Warmed
by the day, and
The
now
wording
giving
in
back
places
its heat
becomes
slowly to
mechanical.
the night. But farther
Boats.
down, the air
Locks.
cools.
Release.
Sound changes. Waters above. The walls tighten. Waters below. Light becomes thinner.
And more
Opened
careful.
boundaries. Here the
Authorized
language of worship
destruction
begins overlapping with the
gods are
language of
not merely
restriction.
surprised by a storm.
Not everyone enters.
They seem entangled
Not
in the
everything is
activation of
unsealed.
something vast and hard to
Not
call
every
back.
name is spoken casually.
I have always found
The source
that more
points toward temple
unnerving
lists
than
and
rain
descriptions
itself.
that include divine weapons
Rain
as
is
housed
natural.
things. Open
Not just
locks
praised
are not
things.
The source
Housed
returns here to the flood text
stored
from Eridu and
wrapped,
Atrahasis. And once the
inspected,
earlier material about
brought out
weapons
according
and
to
command
protocol,
systems has settled in the mind,
returned according to
these
protocol.
passages begin sounding
That
different.
pattern is deeply
The
important.
great waters do not simply
A storm
appear.
god may be praised
They
in
are
public
let loose.
poetry. The
But
deep
an
is
object
opened.
that requires specific
The sky
wrapping
is
and
opened.
chamber control
Barriers
belongs to another
fail
category
in a
of
controlled
sacred
way,
seriousness, or are made
and
to
then
fail.
come the
lining materials. The old order is not
Copper,
overwhelmed accidentally.
lead.
It is
Special
undone
chambers,
by sequence. Special
You
containment.
know that feeling when a myth
The
starts
source
reading like an
does not
operations
present
log
this
under
in a
heavy
childish
symbolic
way.
cover.
And that is why it
That
works.
is the feeling of this section.
It does not say, imagine the scene
Therefore,
not as later
ancient
painted
people
piety
had
likes to
modern
show it,
radiation shielding,
but as a city waiting
as
for
though
something
history
it does not yet
were a cheap
understand.
novel.
Temple roofs
It does something
under strange
subtler
cloud
and much
river
stronger.
air thick and wrong.
It asks why dangerous
Priests
divine
listening for
objects were
instructions no
associated
one
with
wants to
specially
receive.
prepared spaces at all.
The city itself,
Why
still
metal
breathing
lined
with
or
ordinary
specially
life
lined
for a few
chambers
final
recur
hours in the tradition.
ovens,
And
elite,
why that language sits so
doors
comfortably
open,
beside stories
water
of
jars
destructive
moved,
force. Sandals on
radiance,
packed earth, poison wind, a child crying
sleeping
in a
weapons.
courtyard. You know that
Someone
feeling when
carrying
several
grain,
ordinary details begin
someone
muttering
rhyming too
about
well
wind
with one another.
Then,
That is
somewhere
what
beyond
happens here.
human sight, the seals
A
begin to
weapon
fail
with unusual
or
force
are released.
A
And all
chamber
the old
lined
boundaries
unusually
that held
carefully.
the world in its familiar
A wrapping
arrangement
procedure
begin to open.
restricted
The source
handling is especially sharp
warnings,
on the phrase waters above,
a story
and
of
waters
death after
below.
improper access. Mainstream readings
Rituals
treat that
of
cosmologically
calming
and reclosure,
and fairly so.
no single
Since
item
ancient
proves
people
the
imagined
bolder
the world
interpretation
vertically
by itself
in
sacred layers, but together.
But the
they
source
create
asks,
pressure. What happens
pressure
if a
toward the
scribe
conclusion
is trying
that
to
the old
preserve
world
the memory
treated some
of
divine objects
simultaneous
as
release
dangerous
from
in
more
multiple
than a merely
domains.
ceremonial sense?
Atmospheric.
The handling stories are
Hydraulic.
especially haunting.
Subterranean.
The source recounts
Controlled
traditions
systems
in which
breaking open
unsealing
together.
or mishandling led to
Once
death.
that
reading enters the room again,
The
caution
flood
is appropriate.
stops feeling
like one
priests
big
often
storm
use fear to
and
protect
starts
sanctity
feeling
and authority.
like an event chain.
Sacred trespass
And event chains
kills
belong
in
to
ancient
systems
narrative.
all the time.
That is where the connection to
Yet
the
when
earlier
such
weapons
warnings
become
appear in
so
a textual
powerful,
world already dense with
we have
named
already
arsenals,
seen distributed attack
command
in the
devices,
7.
and
We have already
deployable
seen
radiance,
environmental
they
manipulation
begin
in
sounding
Marduk's
less
winds.
like pure moral
We have
theater
already seen
and more
command
like
failure in the
inherited
theft of the
protocol
tablet of destinies.
wrapped in religious form.
Now the flood appears.
Honestly,
and
that
it
is
too
one of the
behaves
saddest
less like
possibilities
emotion
in the whole
and more
script.
like managed catastrophe.
The rituals may survive.
The source does
after
not
the
need to
mechanisms
prove
are
a neat
forgotten.
mechanism. People
It only
continue
needs to
closing,
show how consistently
binding
the texts
wrapping,
remember release,
naming,
rather than mere
and
occurrence.
avoiding.
Not because
Honestly,
they understand the original
that
function,
is enough to keep
but
me
because
awake.
their ancestors taught
Because
them
once
that
a
culture
neglect
begins
is fatal,
imagining destruction
that
this
is how
way,
dangerous knowledge
through
often
opening,
survives.
release,
By becoming taboo,
authorized
before
deployment,
it can become fully
and later
explained.
vows never to repeat.
The source also
The
returns
emotional
here to the
world
grammar of
changes.
operations.
And
The
I
flood
think it
becomes
deserves
something closer
another
to a
slow
weapon
look.
of last resort.
Ancient
A
scribes
thing
use
too
verbs
large
with
even for those
procedural
who ordered
force
it to feel entirely
to
safe
activate
around
once it is moving.
to station.
That last part
To
matters
return.
very much.
To calm.
The gods themselves
To
become
bend.
afraid.
To
The source
open.
lingers on this with
To
excellent
close.
instinct.
To
In
awaken.
the old flood traditions, the
To
gods
set
are often
in
not
place.
serene masters floating
To
above
direct
events.
toward.
They are
The
frightened
language
by
often
what they have
behaves as though
unleashed.
divine violence is
They
not
draw
random
back.
overflow from
They
emotional
gather.
gods.
They
But
grieve.
power under administration.
They regret. Even in
That is
poetry,
such
the
a
structure
strange and
persists.
specific feature.
That
If
persistence
the flood were
is what
only a
matters.
symbolic moral cleansing,
It is difficult for a tradition to
preserve
preserve
divine
procedural
fear so
texture
strongly?
accidentally For too many centuries, in too many contexts, by the scale unless something in the tradition still cares about the distinction the inherited memory behind the text and another already knew this truth very well. Verbs are patient things. Systems of catastrophic release the memory of use are often easier to authorize so the source lets the temple inventories I think that is one of the most human pieces of the entire tradition. The object named the old scribes may be the object not have known exactly what world their copies preserved. The radiance described in battle that may be the radiance feared that sickening realization after the weapon asleep in the chamber when no prayer the can same put the force back into city's prey will never wake. The source then tightens once the those layers between flood and containment. The old pointing to later ritual language becomes astonishingly less like praise and more like prevention. Not in the sense that every ambiguity vanishes. Pacification, but in the sense that literature, sacred formulas, ritual, and storage practice all start behaving like parts of one closed. That coherence appeasing dangerous forces the source rather than merely worshiping glorious and the cedar forest. This is where Mesopotamian religion begins feeling almost like inherited civil defense. The way up the temple becomes a place not only of incapacitating effects, but of memory management. All of it now sounds less isolated management too. The forest that idea grows stronger when the source moves from the guardian emits a field of terror physical storage disabling force. Temple inventories must divine weapons. Counter chambers are described as lined, once more sealed. The old stories specially prepared do not talk like abstract some myths objects drifting in dreamland. They some talk like remembered encounters with some controlled hostile by restricted personnel. I have always thought the most revealing thing about a civilization disturbing is not because it suggests power, improper access, but how it arranges itself around power, not metaphorical death. Mesopotamia arranged itself around these divine weapons with caution. Actual and then fatal consequences tied to handling what should have remained closed. This may be my favorite part of the entire source. Of course, because it is the most human. Ancient literature loves after all the tales. All the priests protect sacred authority through narratives of danger all the time. What remains at the very edge of many tablets, the pattern remains is the voice of the copyist. Divine weapons are not treated like decorative emblems. Checked and they are stored like things written and reviewed with ongoing risk. Sometimes uncertain. If you were standing in one of those lower rooms beneath fragmentary, the air cooler, sometimes the ancient equivalent of saying older, this line is damaged, and a wrapped object lay on a platform before you reading while someone recited the proper names. I find that so moving. I do not think you would experience the moment of this strange material were not conquerors. You would experience it as procedure. They were readers with lamps. That is why the source keeps drawing our attention away from modern categories and back toward ancient behavior. Even if we cannot settle the culture of every weapon or every battle, it named the colophons prove one thing them beyond dispute, restricted them. Ancient scribes believed these texts were worth preserving their descriptions. They did not casually improvise when naming dangerous whatever interpretive layer we choose. They transmitted what they had, even when the edges had already started to fray. Theological. That does not make the technological. Those behaviors are real parts of the textual tradition. It makes the question durable. And the source, and that does not stop there, is everything. It also begins because by the grammar of operations. That the source has shown us a world, but it is one of the most revealing parts named as the whole argument. Where weapons the verbs in these texts operation are often procedural. Where systems fail when command is stolen. Where the flood behaves like catastrophic release. To send. Where temple chambers behave like vaults. To darken. Where rituals look like containment. To cross. Where physical handling can make sleep. Where the grammar of battle sounds procedural. And where the last people in the chain copy all of ancient myth with enough discipline to make later generations wonder whether myth alone is really sufficient around weapon to account for the calm precision of the traditions with unusual density. If you were standing with me in the result lower chambers, is that the old stories keep sounding in the old like memories air of use. Looking at a wrapped object on a stone tell the truth better than titles. While a priest speaks its name softly can be grand and warns you not to reveals what something actually does around it. I think the real feeling would not become part of the same operational would be hesitation as Ninurta's weapons, the deep and bodily hesitation that comes When a
Open the
culture has
barriers.
arranged itself for centuries
Release the waters.
around the assumption that some
Allow
destruction to pass through the structure of the world, dangerous to forget, then afterward dangerous, preserve enough memory to fear doing that hesitation may be the clearest surviving legacy of naturally toward another important battlefield. The source, the seed never demands that we decide too quickly. Many people meet Humbaba as a monster guardian. It becomes stronger, one more mythic obstacle, easy certainty. The source, maybe here's something more technical of cosmic details. Maybe they were political theology, defensive fear, ritualized memory, paralyzing atmosphere. Maybe they were descriptions of technologies filtered through the language available to Bronze Age scribes. The forest becomes less a fairy tale place and more layered, a defended perimeter, preserved, half Humbaba's radiance and still copy terror, because the danger of losing them like felt greater than the danger of carrying them forward. Approach itself becomes hazardous. I think that final possibility the heroes do not simply fight a beast. They penetrate can survive in damaged form. That can become because it repeats the same logic we have already seen. It can be housed in rituals, environmental control, in names, defensive wrappings, threshold, in lined chambers, named fear effects, in colophon, tactical neutralization, habits of fear. Even the old temple adventure, the old Mesopotamian world keeps describing danger as systems. It becomes a memory machine rather than isolated blows. And from here, the story naturally moves that feeling when every story in a civilization starts sounding like it belongs to the same must still be heard with respect. That is what ambiguity by this point in the source. The old anxieties has already done its work. The Sharu has made the question impossible to ignore. The seven. Not whether every detail maps neatly onto our world entering, but whether the scribes the tablet of destinies controlling were preserving something more exact, released, more dangerous, the forest, and more technical than modern comfort. The temple chambers sealed. So the scribes copying all of it in language that is too specific to relax completely into metaphor wrappings, and too ancient to yield one easy modern translation. And faithful copies where the beauty of the story lives. The old weapons are sleeping. It never has to become perhaps only sleeping in language it now. Never has to scream. The flood has already were passed. Definitely missiles. The winds have already These were named. Definitely machines. The tablet of destinies because the has already been smarter than covered. And simply lets the consistency build in the dark. Named as ever, with recurring For one effects. More reader to notice that the oldest war stories on Earth may also be the oldest surviving dossier of weapons. Storage no one later generation was ever ritually containment to understand. Lingering aftermath. The old stories become most unsettling when command itself is a civilization preserving not to this divine awe we have been sitting, but divine operations. Winds, and somewhere in the middle of that preservation sits the most human figure in the entire tale. And flood release. The scribe, who does now the source takes us into something anyway, even stranger. I cannot stop control thinking about him behind them, night after night. That is why the tablet of destinies matters so much. In different centuries, in later summaries, someone it can sound like a grand the same object names into a symbol clay. Of divine right. Sharu, a kind of sacred certificate proving who rules the cosmos. The seven. That is certainly one layer of it. The tablet, but the source keeps asking us to look beneath that layer. He may be preserving how the tablet behaves in the narrative. He may be preserving literature. It does not merely glorify its owner. He may be preserving ritual. It enables action, or perhaps it authorizes command. All three. It while also carrying forward technical fragments from a world and when it is half lost behind that larger system begins to fail. He cannot solve that for us. Is a chilling he can only hand it onward. A jewel can be stolen, and only dignity is harmed. Is what makes a throne can be seized, so and only rank is altered for a moment. They do not come to us as certainty. The tablet of destinies, they come something as different. Faithful uncertainty. It changes what can preserved and because someone knew the material mattered even after the original world behind it had begun slipping away. It changes by the end of this movement. Can the flood no longer what it has been built from the weapon traditions. In that sense, it feels like their largest expression, less like decoration, not only a more punishment story. I have always found it strange that the story preserves that detail. A system unleashed and then regretted the theft of the tablet. The temple no longer feels merely devotional. It feels archival and cautious. The gods do not react like language no longer feels merely poetic. They react like operators whose command center has been breached, and all of that prepares the ground for the final turn of this middle arc. They lose coordination. Where the source gathers temple they lose effective control over the very capacities that had once obeyed them without hesitation, and the physical handling that is divine arsenals particular kind of disturbing conclusion. You know that feeling when a room full of experts suddenly goes silent because the one system everyone depends on has gone dark. Inheritances that could not safely be forgotten here. The old temple follows the myth of Enzu very closely once you imagine it, because it reveals something the battle texts alone but as only imply. That is where the divine warfare next in Mesopotamian tradition, and it is one of the most effective shifts on brute in the entire script. It relies on hierarchy through the text, on authorization. We have seen the named weapons, on a kind of lawful operation to their functions. The tablet is woven. We have followed command loss. Tactical deployment. Anzu seizes it. Flood. The divine order becomes uncertain, defensive, not merely in honor. Now the source turns its attention to the imagine the scene slowly. The chambers, a chamber of command. The inventory, not necessarily as a modern of instruments and glowing materials, because the old world had no such language, but a place of concentrated authority all the gives the literary material weight. The air still. I think this is where the story becomes hardest to wave away. A tablet because mythology like an ornament, broad, but like a thing it to bloom in metaphor, to misplace in splendor. Un grand impossible image. Absence. Storage practice a gap narrow where there should be certainty. Storage practice belongs messages to no longer landing cleanly. Real fear. Forces no longer entirely obedient. Even a fully symbolic those above looking at one another with the terrible realization that a power they thought was permanent was in fact dependent on a removable thing. But the source is right to notice how unusual some of these procedures seem feeling when placed beside the larger vortex. The source handles the response. They do not merely glorify divine weapons. The problem is not solved. They manage them. Imagine descending beneath a temple in Babylon or Nippur. Someone must confront the upper courts are still alive with ordinary sacred life. Reach the crisis. Shoes on stone. Someone must take the tablet back. Once again, the rising, old, safe category of mythology begins to feel too small. The story is acting like a system failure narrative. And a system failed by the narrative, and now giving back its heat slowly to the night. That ordinary success farther down keeps hidden. The air cools. The theft shows that sound command changes is material. The walls tighten. It shows that authority is not just abstract divinity and more careful. It is tied to an object. Here the language of worship begins overlapping with the language of restriction. And once that is clear, the flood not everything is unsealed, sounding different. Not every name is spoken casually, because if there are command points toward temple lists and descriptions that include divine weapons as how release procedures, and if there are sleeping destructive powers maintained under ritual containment, then the flood no longer enters the story as ordinary weather with moral decoration. Brought out according to protocol, it enters as the largest release according to the archive. That the source turns deeply and with remarkable calm. A storm god may be praised in public poetry. It simply lays the old phrases, but an object that requires specific wrapping and becomes hard to ignore belongs to another category of sacred seriousness. The barriers, and then come the lining materials. The waters above and the waters below are let loose. The order special comes from council. Special consequences exceed comfort. The source does not the old phrase in a childish way and waters below, and that is why it works. Becomes almost unbearable. It does not say this way. Therefore, it no longer sounds like modern radiation shielding. It sounds as though history were at least novel. Procedural. It does something subtler and much stronger. domains. It asks why
Two
dangerous
forces
divine objects were
released in
associated
relation
with
to one
specially
another.
prepared spaces at
A
all.
world opened from
Why
multiple
metal
directions
lined
at
or
once.
specially lined chambers.
If a later
recur
copyist
in the
preserved
tradition,
that language,
and
without
why that
fully
language
grasping
sits
the
so
system
comfortably
described,
beside stories
the
of
resulting
destructive
text
force would feel exactly as it does now.
poison wind,
Sacred and sleeping
terrifying.
weapons. You know
and
that
strangely
feeling when
exact.
several ordinary details
I think
begin
that is why
rhyming
the
too
source
well
keeps
with one
pulling
another.
us back to the flood fragment.
That is
in
what
the
happens
archive.
here.
The
The little
weapon
clay
with
tablet was
unusual
never merely
force.
about water. A chamber
It was
lined
about
unusually
sequencing.
carefully. About
A
a
action.
wrapping procedure. About command
Restricted
and
handling.
aftermath.
Warnings.
The flood. And the
But
story
reading
of death after
is the
improper
supreme
access.
war device.
Rituals of
the
calming
catastrophic
and
instrument that
reclosure.
even the gods come to fear.
No single
once it
item
moves
proves
beyond
the bolder
point of
interpretation
recall.
by itself. And that fear
But
is
together,
crucial. They create pressure.
The source does not
Pressure
let us
toward the
forget
conclusion
how frightened
that
the
the
gods
old
become
world
in
treated
these
some
traditions.
divine objects as dangerous.
They do not
in more than
stand
a merely
serenely above the
ceremonial
deluge.
sense, like authors pleased with
The
a finished
handling
chapter.
stories
are especially haunting.
They recoil.
The source
They
recounts
gather in
traditions in which unsealing
grieve.
or mishandling led
They
to
regret.
death. Their
Again,
own fear suggests
caution
that they
is
knew the
appropriate.
force exceeded ordinary
Priests
control.
often use fear
A
to
storm
protect
god
sanctity and
at
authority.
ease with rain is one
Sacred
thing.
trespass
A
kills
council
in
horrified
ancient narrative
by what it has
all the
released
time.
is another. Yet when such
The
warnings
emotional
appear
reality
in a
of the
textual
text
world
begins
already
sounding
dense
less
with
like
named
sermons
arsenals and more like
command
testimony
devices
after irreversible
and
deployment. Deployable radiance.
If you were standing
They
in one
begin
of the
sounding
old
less
cities
like
at the
pure
first hour
moral
of such a
theater
release,
and more like
you would not know the
inherited
language
protocol,
of hydraulic
catastrophe
catastrophe in religious
or engineered
form.
environment. Honestly, you would know
That is one of
only
the
the
saddest
saddest possibilities in the whole
Doors
script.
barred against a danger.
The rituals
No
may
door could
survive
stop.
after the mechanisms are forgotten.
Wind
Too heavy with water.
People
Deep
continue
noises
closing.
where the earth should have
Binding.
stayed silent. Wrapping, channels,
Naming,
overflowing, and
at once.
avoiding. Not because they
Roofs
understand
struck.
the original function,
Streets,
but because
turning
their
to current.
ancestors taught them
The horizon
that neglect
itself
is
gone
fatal.
wrong.
That is how
Someone in
dangerous
the temple
knowledge
knowing
often
more than you
survives.
know.
By
And
becoming
perhaps even
taboo
that
person not
before
knowing
it
can
enough.
become fully explained.
That
That is the kind of world
These
the source
flood
also
texts
returns
preserve.
here to the grammar of operations.
Not clean morality,
and I think it deserves
not neat
another
allegory.
slow look. A world in
Ancient
which people
scribes
felt
used
that
verbs with
catastrophe had been
procedural
decided
force
somewhere beyond them.
to activate,
Then enacted
to
through a
station,
sequence they could only
to
witness.
return.
The source
to
then
calm,
traces the flood back into the
to
broader
bend,
temple world.
to
And this is
open,
where the story grows
to
especially
close,
rich. To awaken. If the
flood
flood was a release,
to set
then
in
what
place,
remained afterward would have
to
to be
direct
managed
toward.
differently. The language
Dangerous
often behaves as though
inheritances
divine
would need
violence is not
stronger
random
ritual.
overflow from emotional
Weapons
gods.
would
need tighter containment.
but
power under administration.
command
traditions would become
Even
more
in
sacred.
poetry,
The structure
not
persists.
less.
That
In other words,
persistence is what
the
matters.
post-flood
temple may have
It is
become an
difficult for a
archive of
tradition
caution.
to preserve procedural
That
texture
phrase has
accidentally
stayed with me for too many centuries,
An
in
archive
too
of
many
caution.
contexts. Unless
It makes
something
sense
in the
of so
tradition
much.
still cares about the
The sealed
distinction
rooms,
between one function and
the
another.
lined chambers,
Verbs are patient
the
things.
wrappings,
They keep the
restricted
memory of
access.
use. The sleeping
the
weapon
source
lets the
formulas,
temple inventories
the
and the
old
war
texts
tears that
begin
begin
almost
illuminating
like
one another.
restraint.
The object
The
named
way
in
later
praise may
kings
be the
claimed
object
possession
wrapped
of
in divine
storage.
weapons, as if
The
inheriting
radiance
state
described
assets
in battle
rather than
may
poetic
be the
titles.
radiance
feared in ritual.
The way scribes preserve
the weapon
terminology
asleep
with
in the
stubborn
chamber may
consistency
be the same
long
after
after
the world
that
behind
city's
it
prey
has
will
faded.
never wake.
By now,
Once
the temple
those
no
layers
longer
begin
feels
touching,
merely religious.
the old
in the modern
Mesopotamian
narrow
world
sense becomes
It
astonishingly
feels like a
coherent
hybrid
space. Not in the
Worship,
sense that every ambiguity
record-keeping,
vanishes, containment, but in the sense that
maintenance,
literature and memory,
ritual,
all folded
and
into
storage
one. Practice all start
Human
behaving
beings
like
often
parts
do
of
that
one
after
system.
trauma.
That coherence
They take what
deepens
frightened
when
them
the source
and make a
revisits
ritual around
Gilgamesh
it,
and the cedar
partly
forest
to honor it,
Humbabas to manage
fear
it,
aura,
partly because
his layered
ritual is one of the
defenses.
few tools
The
left.
way a
Once
punch itself
understanding
seems
has
to
become
trigger
incomplete, incapacitating effects, and so we arrive
All
again
of it now
at the lower
sounds
chambers,
less
isolated than before.
Copper.
The forest
Lead.
is a secured perimeter.
Special lining.
The guardian emits a
Tight
field of
doors.
terror or disabling
Restricted
force.
hands.
The heroes,
The source
must
never
endure.
overplays this.
Counter,
Which is
and
one
breach.
reason it works so well.
Once more,
It simply
the old
says
stories
that the tradition
do not
treats some
talk
divine
like
objects
abstract
as though
myths
proximity
drifting
in dreamland,
exposure.
They talk like
or
remembered
mishandling
encounters
could
with
kill.
controlled, hostile environments.
Even if one resists,
I have
the
always thought the
technological
most revealing
interpretation
thing about our
entirely
civilization
that
is
remains
not how it
a
praises
startling
power,
cultural fact,
but how it arranges itself
the
around
objects
power are not approached
Mesopotamia
like arranged itself
they are
around
approached
these
like
divine
hazards.
weapons with caution. I have always thought
And
hazard
then
is the
we come
secret word
to the
hidden
colophons.
inside all these texts.
This may be my favorite
Not
part of
glory,
the entire source,
not
because
it is the
not
most
myth
human.
alone. After all
Hazard.
the gods,
The source even
all the
returns
winds,
briefly to the old
all
tales
the
of
release
fatal
mechanisms
accidents
and arsenals
after improper access.
what remains at the very
Again,
edge of many tablets
one could read these
is the
as
voice of the
priestly
copyist,
cautionary tales, copied from an
one
older
probably
original,
should, at
checked
least in
and
part.
collated. But the
Written
pattern
and
is what
reviewed,
keeps intensifying the unease.
sometimes uncertain,
Fatal mishandling
sometimes
sits beside
fragmentary.
sealed storage. Sometimes
Sealed
the ancient
storage sits
equivalent of
beside
saying,
named weapons.
this line is damaged.
Named weapons sit
This
beside
section
operational
broken.
language.
This reading difficult.
Operational language sits
I
beside
find
flood
that so
release.
moving. Flood
The final
release
guardians of
sits
this
beside
strange
divine
material
regret.
were not conquerors.
The
or
whole
prophets.
network becomes difficult to
They
flatten
were
back
readers
into
with
harmless
lamps.
symbolism. The source
And still
uses this
the source
beautifully.
remains fair.
It says that
It
even
never
if we
says the
cannot
case is
settle the
closed.
meaning of every weapon
It
or
allows
every battle,
debate.
the colophons
It allows
prove
metaphor.
one thing beyond dispute.
It allows theology.
Ancient scribes
But it
believed
also
these
insists
texts were worth
that the other
preserving
possibility,
exactly. Technical
they did
memory
not
surviving
casually
under sacred
improvise
language
when
naming dangerous
has been
forces
underestimated for too long.
They transmitted what they had.
That is why this part
even
of
when
the
the
story
edges had already
ends
started
not
to
with
fray.
certainty, but
That
with
does
pressure.
not make the technological
The
reading
pressure
certain of a stolen command tablet.
It makes the question durable.
The pressure of opened
And
locks.
that durability
The
is
pressure
everything.
of waters released by
Because by the
sequence
time
rather
we
than
arrive
chance.
here,
The
source
pressure
has
of
shown
gods
us a
themselves
world where
fearing
divine
their own
wars
arsenal
are full of named assets.
The pressure of temples
where
transformed
weapons
into
have
vaults
distinct
of caution.
operational profiles.
All of that leaves us
where
ready for
systems
the final
fail
descent
when command is stolen.
Because once
Where the
command,
flood behaves like
release,
catastrophic release
and storage have all
where
been
temple
laid
chambers
bare.
behave like vaults.
The last question becomes
where rituals look
unavoidable.
like containment.
What exactly did
Where
later
physical
scribes
handling
think they were preserving?
can kill.
Pure
Where the grammar
theology,
of battle sounds procedural.
literary memory,
And where the last people in the chain
ritual
copy all
drama,
of this
with enough
or
discipline
damaged
to make later
fragments
generations
of a much
wonder
older
whether myth
military
alone
and
is really
catastrophic
sufficient
inheritance
to account for the calm
The
precision
source
of the tradition.
saves that human question.
If you
for
were
the
standing
end.
with me in one of
And I
those lower
think
chambers,
that is where it belongs.
breath slow, with
in
the
the old,
copyists,
cool air,
the lined
looking at a
chambers,
wrapped object on a
the
stone
damaged
platform,
colophons, while a priest
and the quiet
speaks its
possibility
name
that
softly
the last guardians
and warns
of this
you
knowledge
not to cross the
preserved it
boundary
precisely
drawn
because
around it.
forgetting it,
I think the
felt
real
even
feeling
more
would not
dangerous
be thrill
than carrying
it
it
would be
forward.
hesitation. In the
The
end,
deep bodily
the
hesitation
deepest
that
mystery
comes
in the
when
clay
a culture has
is not
arranged
whether the
itself for
ancient scribes
centuries
used
around
poetic
the
language
assumption
that some
of course they did.
inheritances are dangerous to
The
touch.
deeper mystery
Dangerous
is why
to
their
forget,
poetic language so
and
often
dangerous
behaves
to
like preserved
misunderstand.
procedure.
That hesitation may be
is
the
the
final
final
surviving
turn
legacy
of the source.
the Anunnaki war
And
tradition.
I think it is the right one.
The source
After
never
all, the
demands that we
named
decide
weapons,
too quickly.
The flood release,
In fact, the sleeping
it becomes
arsenals,
stronger by refusing
the lined
easy
chambers,
certainty.
the command
Maybe
tablet,
these were myths
and the
of
consistent
cosmic order.
operational
Maybe they were
verbs.
political theology.
The temptation is to
Maybe
demand
they were
a
ritualized
single,
memory.
decisive answer.
Maybe they were descriptions
Either
of
the technologies
texts
filtered
are
through the
only
language
myth,
available to Bronze
or they
Age
are
secret
scribes.
technical manuals in disguise.
Maybe they were all of these
But the
at
source
once.
becomes most persuasive when it refuses
preserved,
that crude split.
half understood.
It
and still
suggests
copied
something more
because the
human,
danger of losing them
and therefore
felt
more
greater
haunting
than the danger of carrying them
The
forward.
clay may be preserving several
I
layers
think that
at once.
final
possibility is the one that
Myth.
lingers longest with me.
Memory.
Knowledge can
Ritual.
survive in damaged form.
Technical residue.
It can become sacred
Fear.
before it becomes legible. State ideology. It can be housed in rituals.
Inheritance.
In names. All of them pressed
wrappings.
together. Then lined
copied
by
chambers.
generations
In
who knew
felt.
the wording mattered.
In colophon.
Even when the
In
original
habits of
world
fear.
behind the wording had grown
The old
dim.
temple then becomes
I have always
more
thought
than
that
a
is how
religious
dangerous
space.
knowledge really survives.
It becomes a memory machine, not cleanly.
And from here the
Not
story
in
naturally
one poor
moves toward
form.
its last quiet phase.
It survives by wearing
The
several coats at
mainstream
once.
scholarly reading must still
The source
be heard
gathers
with
the
respect.
final pieces of evidence. The
Very
ambiguity
carefully.
must remain honest.
Temple inventories
But the clay
listing divine
has already
weapons,
done its work.
not as vague
It
abstractions,
has made the question
but
impossible
as
to
housed
ignore.
things. Not whether
Storage
every detail
practices
maps
involving
neatly onto our
wrapping,
world, but
inspection,
whether the scribes of
and
Sumer and
controlled
Babylon
access
were preserving something
chambers
more
prepared
exact,
with unusual
more
materials,
dangerous, and more
verbs of
technical than
opening,
modern comfort prefers
sealing,
to admit. Sending, so
returning,
we rest here beneath
calming,
the temple,
awakening,
among copper, directing,
lead, wrappings,
battle narratives that
sealed
preserve not
rooms,
only divine splendor,
damaged lines,
but sequence and faithful copyists.
target environment,
The old
penetrations,
weapons are sleeping,
lingering aftermath,
or perhaps only
and
sleeping
command
in language
disruption.
now. The flood
Protective
has already
formulas
passed that sound less
the
like
winds
praise
have already
and more
been
like
named.
restraint. The tablet
Each
of
item
destinies has
alone
already
can be
been
softened.
stolen and recovered. Together,
And
they begin
still
resisting,
the clay waits
softening in the dark.
Then the
Patient
source
as
gives
ever.
the mainstream
For one
scholarly
more reader
reading
to notice
the
that
respect
the
it
oldest war
deserves.
stories on Earth may also
This
be
matters.
the oldest surviving dossier.
A story
of
like
weapons.
this becomes weaker
No one later
if it
generation
pretends
was
scholars
ever
are
fully
foolish
meant
or blind
to understand. Many of them
The old
are
stories
careful,
become most
precisely
unsettling
when command
because
itself
ancient
is stolen.
texts are slippery.
Up to this
A
point,
storm can be
we
a
have been
storm
sitting
and a
among
god
weapons
at the same time.
winds. A net can
Radiance,
be a weapon and a symbol
sleeping
of lawful
arsenal.
control. A
And
radiance
flood
can be
release.
physical fear, but now the source
Spiritual
takes us
authority,
into something
or
even
both.
stranger.
The
The control
source admits all
mechanism
of that.
behind them. It does not deny
That is why the
complexity.
Tablet of Destinies matters so
It simply
much.
says,
In
complexity
later summaries,
does
it
not
can
erase
sound like a grand,
specificity.
holy object.
That is
A
the
symbol of
distinction
divine right.
everything rests on.
A kind of sacred certificate
Specificity
proving
is why the
who
Sharu
rules
matters.
the cosmos.
Specificity
That is certainly
is why the
one
seven
layer
matter.
of it.
Specificity
But the source
is
keeps
why
asking us
the
to look
Imhulu
beneath that layer
matters. And notice how the tablet
Specificity
behaves
is
in
why the
narrative.
Tablet of Destinies matters.
It does not merely glorify its
Specificity
owner.
is why the flood
It
release
enables
matters.
action. It authorizes
Specificity
command.
is why the temple vaults matter.
It stabilizes a
And
larger
perhaps
system.
most of all, and when it is
Specificity
taken, is why the colophons
that larger
matter.
system begins to fail.
I think the colophons
That
may be the
is a
most
chilling
moving part of
pattern.
the whole tradition. A jewel can be stolen.
At the bottom,
and
only
more back of
dignity
the
is
tablet.
harmed. After
A
gods
throne can be
and
seized,
wars and
only rank
terrifying
is altered
names,
for a moment.
the voice of the
But the
copyist
Tablet of
appears
Destinies
quietly, does something different.
Copied from an older original.
It changes what can
Checked against
and
another
cannot
tablet.
operate. Broken
It changes
in the middle.
who can issue binding
A
instruction.
line, uncertain. It changes whether
The
the
ancient
divine
equivalent
order
of a scholar
can carry
saying,
out what it has been
I
built
did not
to
invent
carry
this.
out. I
In that
inherited it,
sense,
and I am
the
doing
source
my
treats
best
it less
not
like
to damage it
decoration,
further, and more like a
That
key.
humility changes the
I have
feeling
always
of the
found it
story at
strange
once.
that the story preserves that
We
detail
are no
so
longer
stubbornly.
imagining priests
The
inventing
theft
wild
of the
fantasies
tablet
to frighten
does
their
not
audience.
simply embarrass heaven.
We are imagining tired,
It paralyzes
careful,
The
disciplined
gods
scribes,
do not react like
preserving
rulers
inherited
insulted in
material
public
under difficult conditions.
They react like operators
They are
whose
not
command
always
center has been
sure.
breached. They
Some
lose
lines
confidence.
are broken.
They lose
Some signs are
coordination.
damaged.
They lose
Some readings are
effective
disputed,
control over the very
But the
capacities
names
that had
remain.
once obeyed them without
The
hesitation.
sequences remain.
That is a very
The dangerous
particular
things
kind of panic.
remain named.
You know that feeling
That
when a room
persistence
full of
tells us
experts
something
suddenly goes
fundamental.
silent because the one system
Even
everyone
when
depends on
understanding
has gone
frayed.
dark. Preservation
That is
did
the
not
emotional
stop.
tone here.
You know that feeling.
The source
when
follows
someone
the myth
saves
of
a
Anzu
formula
very
because they are
closely
not certain
because it
what
reveals
does,
something the battle
but
texts
they are
alone
absolutely
only
certain
imply.
it should not be lost. Divine warfare,
That is
in
the feeling of
Mesopotamian
these
tradition,
closing tablets.
does not rely only on brute
The
force.
source also brings us
It
back
relies
one
on
last
hierarchy,
time to the physicality
on
of
authorization,
clay,
on
baked
correct
mud,
sequencing, fired
on a
by
kind of
accident
lawful
or by
operation.
intent. The tablet
Buried
is
in
woven
collapsed
into
archives.
that law. Dug up centuries later,
Anzu
with
seizes
dust
it,
still clinging
the divine
to the wedge
order
marks.
becomes uncertain.
Clay is
Not
such
merely
a
an
humble
honor,
material
for
but in
carrying
function,
terrifying possibilities.
Imagine the scene slowly.
No glowing artifact,
A chamber of command.
no polished metal throne,
Not necessarily as a modern
just
room of
earth
instruments
pressed
and glowing
by hand.
panels.
because
Yet
the
that
old
humility
world had no
is part
such
of what
language,
makes the case so strong.
but a place of concentrated authority.
If the
all
old
the same,
world truly needed to preserve
the air
dangerous
still,
names and sequences across
the old
catastrophe,
power of stored
clay
names
would be exactly the right
a tablet
medium,
carried not like an
cheap,
ornament, but like a
durable,
thing too important to
copyable,
misplace even once,
hard to erase once
then
fired.
theft. That may be the great
Absence,
irony of the
a gap
whole Anunnaki
where there should
war
be
tradition.
certainty.
The
Most
messages
dangerous
no longer
memories
landing
survived in
cleanly.
the softest material,
Forces no longer
and now
entirely
we,
obedient. Much later,
those
sit
above
by
looking
a
at
small
one another
fire
with the
and read
terrible
it,
realization that a power
or
they
try to
thought
read
was
it,
permanent was in fact
because the
dependent on
final
a
emotion
removable
of the
thing.
source is not triumph.
That dependence
may be the
it
most
is
modern feeling in the
uncertainty,
whole source, and not the lazy
The
kind.
source
handles the response
honest
with equal
uncertainty.
care. The
Some
problem
scholars
is not
will
solved through
continue to
metaphor.
say,
These are myths
it is solved
of
through
kingship.
recovery,
Chaos. Someone
order,
must confront
plague,
the thief.
flood,
Someone must breach
political
the crisis.
theology.
And there is
Someone
real
must
truth
take the
there.
tablet back.
Others will continue
Once
to
again,
hear
the old
echoes of
safe
technology's
category of
remembered
mythology
through
begins
inadequate
to feel
language.
too small.
And there may be truth
The
there
story
too.
is acting like a system
The
failure
source does not
narrative.
ask us to end
And
the
a
debate
system
tonight.
failure narrative.
It asks
always
us to
reveals
notice that the
the
debate
structure
exists
that
for a
ordinary
reason.
success
Keeps hidden.
The texts keep resisting
The theft
reduction.
shows that command
Honestly,
is material. That resistance
it shows
is what
that authority
convinces
is
me
not
the
just
most abstract divinity.
If the old material
It
were
is
merely
tied to an
random
object.
fantasy,
A
it would
process,
feel looser,
an access point.
If it were merely
And
ritual
once that is clear,
abstraction, it would
the
care
flood
less
stories
about operational
begin sounding
distinction.
different.
If it
All
were
over
merely
again. Later speculation.
Because if there are
It would not
command
sit
objects,
so stubbornly inside
if there
the
are
oldest
named
administrative
arsenals,
civilization on Earth,
if there are release procedures
copied with such care,
and if
through
there
so
are
many
sleeping
centuries,
destructive powers maintained
the fact that
under
it
ritual
remains
containment
difficult is itself
then the flood
part
no
of the
longer
evidence.
enters the story as
So let the
ordinary
final
weather
picture
with moral
be a
decoration.
simple one.
A
It
lower
enters
chamber
as the largest
under a
release
Mesopotamian
in the
temple.
archive.
Cool air
The source
against
turns
old
there
brick,
with remarkable
a
calm.
wrapped object
It does
resting
not
on a stone
shout.
platform.
It simply lays the
Copper
old phrases
somewhere in the
beside
dark,
one another until the shape
a
becomes
priest
hard
reciting
to ignore.
names not loudly,
The locks
but
are opened.
correctly.
The
Above him,
barriers, the
fail.
city, sleeping
The
beside
waters
river,
above
and the waters
farther
below
above
are let loose.
the stars over
The
Babylon
order comes
or
from
Nippur
council or The
Indifferent
consequences
and
exceed
clear.
comfort. And beside
The
all
old
of that,
phrase, waters
in another
above
room and waters below,
a scribe
becomes
bending
almost
over damp
unbearable.
clay,
Once heard this
pressing
way.
into it the old words
It no
for
longer
weapons.
sounds only cosmological.
Winds, flood,
It sounds mechanical.
command,
or at
radiance,
least procedural,
and fear.
two reservoirs.
He does not know that people thousands
Two
of years
domains
later will argue over
two
whether he
held
preserved
forces
theology
released
or
in
technical
relation
memory.
to one another. He does not
A
know that
world opened
museums
from
will one
multiple
day hold
directions
his
at once.
tablet in white light.
If a later
He
copyist
does not know that
preserved that
scholars will
language
quarrel
without
over
fully
translation,
grasping the system
over
described,
metaphor,
the
over
resulting
whether the
text
strange
would
precision
feel
in his
exactly
lines
as it
was
does
literary
now,
or practical.
sacred,
He
terrifying.
only knows that the
and
text matters
strangely
enough to
exact.
copy.
I think
That is
why
the
the
final
source
human
keeps pulling
truth
us
in the
back to the
story.
flood fragment in the
The
archive.
clay survived because
The
someone
little clay
cared.
tablet was never merely
The
about
name
water.
survived because
It was
someone
about sequencing.
cared.
The
About
dangerous
action.
things remained named
About
because
command
someone
and aftermath.
cared. The flood.
And now the question survives
in this reading
because the tablets
is
still
the
carry
supreme
enough precision
war
to trouble
device.
us. Perhaps
The catastrophic
that is all the
instrument
old
that even
scribes
the
hope
gods
to
come
achieve,
to fear,
once it
not
moves
perfect
beyond the point of
understanding.
recall. And that fear
Continuation.
is crucial. And in that sense,
The source does
succeeded.
not let us forget how
The
frightened
archive
the gods
still
become
holds
in these
the
traditions.
flood fragment. They do not
The old
stand
epics
serenely
still
above
hold
the
the
Sharu
deluge,
like authors
the
pleased
Mito,
with a finished chapter.
the Melamu,
They
the
recoil.
Seven,
The winds.
they gather in shock.
The net.
They
The stolen
grieve.
tablet. They regret.
The temples may be gone.
Their own
or
fear
broken,
suggests that they knew
but their
the
lines
forced
exceeded
chambers
ordinary
still live in
control.
text. A storm
The
god
gods have
at
become
ease
literature
with rain
to many
is
readers.
one thing, but their
The
operational
council,
language,
horrified
still
by what it has
glints through the
released,
poetry,
is another.
like metal under
The emotional
cloth.
reality of the text
The mystery
begins sounding
remains
less like
unclosed
and more like testimony.
What did Sumerian
after
texts
irreversible
reveal
deployment.
about the weapons used in
If
the
you were
Anunnaki
standing
war?
in one of the old cities,
They
at the
reveal
first hour
at
of
least
such a release,
this much.
you would not know
The
the
ancient
language of
world
hydraulic
remembered
catastrophe
destructive
or
powers
engineered
with a
environment
precision that later
you
ages
would know
were never able
only
to
the
smooth away
signs.
completely.
Doors
It
barred against a
remembered
danger
command
no
systems,
door could stop. Release systems,
wind too heavy with water,
containment, deep noises
aftermath,
where the earth should have
and
stayed
fear.
silent.
It remembered
Channels
enough to make us
overflowing
wonder
at
whether
once.
mythology was the surface.
Roofs struck,
And something older,
streets
turning
stranger,
to current, and more exact,
the horizon
remained
itself
beneath.
gone wrong.
That is enough to let the
Someone
fire
in the
burn
temple
low
knowing
beside us.
more than you know,
Enough
and
to let
perhaps
the
even that
room go
person not
still.
knowing enough.
Enough to leave
That is
the
the
clay
kind of
where it
world
belongs
these flood
now,
texts preserve.
in darkness,
Not
in
clean
morality,
in the patient
not
custody
custody
of
of
time.
time. Still
A world
waiting
in
for
which
the
people
next
felt that
careful
catastrophe had been decided
Good night.
somewhere beyond them.
then enacted through a sequence they could only witness. The source then traces the flood back into the broader temple world, and this is where the story grows especially rich. If the flood was a release, then what remained afterward would have to be managed differently. Dangerous inheritances would need stronger ritual. Weapons would need tighter containment. Command traditions would become more sacred, not less. In other words, the post-flood temple may have become an archive of caution. That phrase has stayed with me. An archive of caution. It makes sense of so much. The sealed rooms, the lined chambers, the wrappings, the restricted access, the sleeping weapon formulas, the old prayers that sound almost like restraint, the way later kings claim possession of divine weapons as if inheriting state assets rather than poetic titles, the way scribes preserve terminology with stubborn consistency long after the world behind it has faded. By now, the temple no longer feels merely religious in the modern narrow sense. It feels like a hybrid space. Worship, record-keeping, containment, maintenance, and memory all folded into one. Human beings often do that after trauma. They take what frightened them and make a ritual around it, partly to honor it, partly to manage it, partly because ritual is one of the few tools left once understanding has become incomplete. And so we arrive again at the lower chambers. Copper, lead, special lining, tight doors, restricted hands. The source never overplays this, which is one reason it works so well. It simply says that the tradition treats some divine objects as though proximity, exposure, or mishandling could kill. Even if one resists the technological interpretation entirely, that remains a startling cultural fact. The objects are not approached like ornaments. They are approached like hazards. I have always thought hazard is the secret word hidden inside all these texts. Not glory, not majesty, not myth alone. Hazard. The source even returns briefly to the old tales of fatal accidents after improper access. Again, one could read these as priestly cautionary tales. One probably should, at least in part. But the pattern is what keeps intensifying the unease. Fatal mishandling sits beside sealed storage. Sealed storage sits beside named weapons. Named weapons sit beside operational language. Operational language sits beside flood release. Flood release sits beside divine regret. The whole network becomes difficult to flatten back into harmless symbolism. And still, the source remains fair. It never says the case is closed. It allows debate. It allows metaphor. It allows theology. But it also insists that the other possibility, technical memory surviving under sacred language, has been underestimated for too long. That is why this part of the story ends not with certainty, but with pressure. The pressure of a stolen command tablet. The pressure of opened locks. The pressure of waters released by sequence rather than chance. The pressure of gods themselves fearing their own arsenal. The pressure of temples transformed into vaults of caution. All of that leaves us ready for the final descent. Because once command, release, and storage have all been laid bare, the last question becomes unavoidable. What exactly did later scribes think they were preserving? Pure theology, literary memory, ritual drama, or damaged fragments of a much older military and catastrophic inheritance? The source saves that human question for the end, and I think that is where it belongs, with the copyists, the lined chambers, the damaged colophons, and the quiet possibility that the last guardians of this knowledge preserved it precisely because forgetting it felt even more dangerous than carrying it forward. In the end, the deepest mystery in the clay is not whether the ancient scribes used poetic language. Of course they did. The deeper mystery is why their poetic language so often behaves like preserved procedure. That is the final turn of the source, and I think it is the right one. After all the named weapons, the flood release, the sleeping arsenals, the lined chambers, the command tablet, and the consistent operational verbs, the temptation is to demand a single decisive answer. Either the texts are only myth, or they are secret technical manuals in disguise. But the source becomes most persuasive when it refuses that crude split. It suggests something more human, and therefore more haunting. The clay may be preserving several layers at once. Myth, memory, ritual, technical residue, fear, state ideology, inheritance. All of them pressed together, then copied by generations who knew the wording mattered, even when the original world behind the wording had grown dim. I have always thought that is how dangerous knowledge really survives. Not cleanly, not in one poor form. It survives by wearing several coats at once. The source gathers the final pieces of evidence very carefully. Temple inventories listing divine weapons not as vague abstractions, but as housed things. Storage practices involving wrapping, inspection, and controlled access. Chambers prepared with unusual materials. Verbs of opening, sealing, sending, returning, calming, awakening, directing. Battle narratives that preserve not only divine splendor, but sequence, target environment, penetration, lingering aftermath, and command disruption. Protective formulas that sound less like praise and more like restraint. Each item alone can be softened. Together, they begin resisting, softening. Then the source gives the mainstream scholarly reading the respect it deserves. This matters. A story like this becomes weaker if it pretends scholars are foolish or blind. Many of them are careful, precisely because ancient texts are slippery. A storm can be a storm and a god at the same time. A net can be a weapon and a symbol of lawful control. A radiance can be physical fear, spiritual authority, or both. The Source admits all of that. It does not deny complexity. It simply says, complexity does not erase specificity. That is the distinction everything rests on. Specificity is why the Sharu matters. Specificity is why the seven matter. Specificity is why the Imhulu matters. Specificity is why the Tablet of Destinies matters. Specificity is why the flood release matters. Specificity is why the temple vaults matter. And perhaps most of all, specificity is why the colophons matter. I think the colophons may be the most moving part of the whole tradition. At the bottom or back of a tablet, after gods and wars and terrifying names, the voice of the copyist appears quietly. Copied from an older original, checked against another tablet, broken in the middle, a line uncertain. The ancient equivalent of a scholar saying, "I did not invent this. I inherited it, and I am doing my best not to damage it further." That humility changes the feeling of the story at once. We are no longer imagining priests inventing wild fantasies to frighten their audience. We are imagining tired, careful, disciplined scribes preserving inherited material under difficult conditions. They are not always sure. Some lines are broken. Some signs are damaged. Some readings are disputed. But the names remain. The sequences remain. The dangerous things remain named. That persistence tells us something fundamental. Even when understanding frayed, preservation did not stop. You know that feeling when someone saves a formula because they are not certain what it does, but they are absolutely certain it should not be lost. That is the feeling of these closing tablets. The Source also brings us back one last time to the physicality of clay. Baked mud, fired by accident or by intent, buried in collapsed archives, dug up centuries later with dust still clinging to the wedge marks. Clay is such a humble material for carrying terrifying possibilities. No glowing artifact, no polished metal throne, just earth pressed by hand. Yet that humility is part of what makes the case so strong. If the old world truly needed to preserve dangerous names and sequences across catastrophe, clay would be exactly the right medium. Cheap, durable, copyable, hard to erase once fired. That may be the great irony of the whole Anunnaki war tradition. The most dangerous memory survived in the softest material. And now we, much later, sit by a small fire and read it, or try to read it. Because the final emotion of the Source is not triumph. It is uncertainty, and not the lazy kind. Honest uncertainty. Some scholars will continue to say these are myths of kingship, chaos, order, plague, flood, and political theology. And there is real truth there. Others will continue to hear echoes of technologies remembered through inadequate language, and there may be truth there too. The Source does not ask us to end the debate tonight. It asks us to notice that the debate exists for a reason. The texts keep resisting reduction. Honestly, that resistance is what convinces me the most. If the old material were merely random fantasy, it would feel looser. If it were merely ritual abstraction, it would care less about operational distinction. If it were merely later speculation, it would not sit so stubbornly inside the oldest administrative civilization on Earth, copied with such care through so many centuries. The fact that it remains difficult is itself part of the evidence. So let the final picture be a simple one. A lower chamber under a Mesopotamian temple. Cool air against old brick. A wrapped object resting on a stone platform. Copper somewhere in the dark. A priest reciting names not loudly, but correctly. Above him, the city sleeping beside the river. Farther above, the stars over Babylon or Nippur or indifferent and clear. And beside all of that, in another room, a scribe bending over damp clay, pressing into it the old words for weapons. Winds, flood, command, radiance, and fear. He does not know that people thousands of years later will argue over whether he preserved theology or technical memory. He does not know that museums will one day hold his tablet in white light. He does not know that scholars will quarrel over translation, over metaphor, over whether the strange precision in his lines was literary or practical. He only knows that the text matters enough to copy. That is the final human truth in the story. The clay survived because someone cared. The names survived because someone cared. The dangerous things remained named because someone cared. And now the question survives because the tablets still carry enough precision to trouble us. Perhaps that is all the old scribes hoped to achieve. Not perfect understanding. Continuation. And in that sense they succeeded. The archive still holds the flood fragment. The old epics still hold the Sharu, the Mitu, the Melamu, the Seven, the Winds, the Net, the stolen tablet. The temples may be gone or broken, but their lined chambers still live in text. The gods have become literature to many readers, but their operational language still glints through the poetry like metal under cloth. The mystery remains unclosed. What did Sumerian texts reveal about the weapons used in the Anunnaki war? They revealed at least this much. The ancient world remembered destructive powers with a precision that later ages were never able to smooth away completely. It remembered command systems, release systems, containment, aftermath, and fear. It remembered enough to make us wonder whether mythology was the surface, and something older, stranger, and more exact remained beneath. That is enough to let the fire burn low beside us. Enough to let the room go still. Enough to leave the clay where it belongs now, in darkness, in storage, in the patient custody of time, still waiting for the next careful reader. Good night.